Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today we're looking at part 2 of my series on arguments for classical theism. Once again, a big thanks to Salem from the channel Inspiring Christianity. Go subscribe to his channel. I have a link in the description. This is just going to be a continuation of that last video. It's not absolutely necessary that you watch it, but it is kind of recommended. But anyway, let's get into the video. Okay, so I covered a bunch of natural theological arguments in part 1, like Aquinas' 5 ways and Phaser's 5 proofs, and in arguments from aseity and the Euthyphro dilemma and theological arguments and all sorts of things. But now we're into the category of other. And so we're just going to be looking at tons of different arguments that different thinkers have leveled in favor of classical theism. So this is going to be a really, really fun and actually unorthodox arguments that you guys have probably never heard of. So I'm very excited for this. So first we're going to look at Vallicella. I know it's probably pronounced Vallicella, but I like Vallicella, so I'm just going to say Vallicella. This is his broadly Neo-Platonic argument. So premise 1, it is possible that facts exist. 2, if it is possible that facts exist, then an external unifier necessarily exists. Therefore, an external unifier necessarily exists. And he goes through these premises in these 2 sources down below, from Facts to God and Onto-Cosmological Argument in IJPR, and in his book, A Paradigm Theory of Existence, Onto Theology Vindicated. So there are different steps and substeps within these, but it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. I just want to include this in here. Now, many and or most of the responses given to the Neo-Platonic proof apply mutatis mutandis, that is, with requisite changes here. For example, plausibly, you could have an internal explanation of a fact's unity. That is to say, if a fact includes a variety of distinct elements or parts, as it were, well, plausibly, one of those very elements can explain the unity of the fact as a whole, just by being one of the very parts or elements or factors within the fact itself. So for instance, it's no coincidence that, say, omniscience and omnipotence and essential moral perfection and perfect freedom and perfect rationality and so on, it's no surprise that these kind of form a unified plurality in the neoclassical theistic God, right? Why is that? Well, because they all flow from one simple aspect of God, namely God's sheer unlimited perfection. And so in this case, we have a fact, say, the unity of all of God's parts, as it were, using the classical theistic understanding of parts, where properties count as parts. We have an internal explanation of the unity of the parts in terms of one of those very parts, namely in terms of one of those very properties, namely just sheer unlimited perfection. And that just seems eminently plausible. And again, go back and listen to the stuff that I said on the Neoplatonic proof for more on this point. It's also probably going to face problems for Trinitarianism and problems for the incarnation. I, again, just advise you guys to go back and look at the Neoplatonic proof stuff. It also plausibly ends up being perfectly compatible with non-classical theistic views of God and even non-theistic necessary foundation, or so I would argue. I think it's plausible that you're only going to need an external unifier to unify facts if those facts themselves are, say, contingent. They kind of cry out for explanation. And if you're a neoclassical theist, you're probably going to say if they're limited in various ways, if they have certain arbitrary limits, a la Josh Rasmussen, right? It's that calls out for an explanation and calls out for an external unifier. By contrast, if you have a non-arbitrarily limited or an unlimited being, sheer perfection, and it's a necessary being, you don't need an external unifier in terms of some absolutely simple being. You might also have bootstrapping worries that apply to the argument. So for instance, it is a fact that the external unifier U causes, say, the universe. Now, some philosophers don't believe in facts. They think that there are no such things as facts, right? So Vallicella himself gives a kind of truth maker defense as to why we should think that there are facts. So plausibly there are truths, propositions are true, right? And they're true in virtue of corresponding to the world, the way the world is. And Vallicella argues that the worldly correlates, the things to which propositions correspond are going to be facts. It's not enough to just have the object, say, or the object and the property, say, or these other sorts of things. You need the fact. The fact that grass is green is the truth maker for the proposition grass is green. But if that's the case, well, then you can take the proposition that the external unifier U causes, say, the universe. Well, like in virtue of what is this true? Surely it must correspond with the world in some way and correspond to a fact per Vallicella's argument, so it would seem. So someone might argue. But in that case, U itself is internal to this fact. U is one of the very elements of this fact itself, right? U enters into the fact, as it were. The fact is that the external unifier U causes, say, the universe. But then U is, as it were, a part of this fact. By definition, U cannot be the external unifier of this fact, since U is within or internal to this fact. And so we land in a unified fact without an external unifier, contra the argument's requirement of an external unifier for facts, or at least so this objection would say, so this bootstrapping objection. Remember from my last video, the really important points at the beginning where I said that presenting a criticism does not necessarily entail that I endorse it. I'm trying to give you guys tools to think critically and think reasonably about the ultimate nature of reality. And so on and so on and so on. So again, see the section on the Neo-Platonic proof, because a lot of those criticisms are going to apply here, because his argument is indeed a broadly Neo-Platonic argument. As is Stephen Nemes, the wonderfully mustached individual. He's my friend. Yeah, we're pals. But yeah, he's great. Stephen Nemes, he has a this such argument. So in general or in formal terms, the argument essentially says that composite beings are always a mixture of two distinct principles: a principle of intelligibility, which is of itself universal and not tied down to any concrete particular, and a principle of individuation, which is of itself particular and indeterminate. So for instance, if you have a particular cat, which is a composite object, you have its principle of intelligibility, which is just like the universal or form of catness, right? But that of itself is universal. It's not tied down to any concrete particular, because you can have multiple cats, say, and they all share something in common, namely catness. And so you need something else. You need a principle of individuation in order to form the particular concrete individual cat. But the principle of individuation is of itself particular and indeterminate. It is, as it were, receptive to a variety of forms or universals. Because neither the two principles demand that they be combined with one another, there's nothing inherent to the principle of individuation that it entails or requires that it be conjoined to a specific principle of intelligibility, and vice versa. So because neither of these two principles demand that they be combined with one another, there must be some extrinsic cause or principle which accounts for their unity. Now, once more, many/most of the responses given to the Neoplatonic proof are going to apply mutatis mutandis here. So see that section, metaphysical necessity and internal explanation, all these other sorts of things, as well as the variety of existential inertialist responses and a whole host of different responses. So again, see that Neoplatonic proof section. It's going to be very important, because this is, again, is a kind of broadly Platonic, Neoplatonic argument. And for a more systematic or rigorous or formal presentation of the argument itself than my little kind of informal thing here, as well as a wide variety of criticisms of it, you can check out the following video that I made from minute 30:46 to 1 hour and 8 minutes and 4 seconds. Okay, on to Spitzer, Father Robert Spitzer, on unconditioned reality. So a conditioned reality is just something that is dependent on another for its existence or occurrence. So there are conditioned things. There are no circles of conditioned realities, and nor are there infinite regresses of conditioned realities. And so also nothing is conditioned on itself. Nothing can be like self-dependent, as it were. And so there's at least one unconditioned reality that does indeed follow from those. But whatever is unconditioned is necessarily unique, absolutely simple, unlimited, and unrestricted intelligibility and understanding. And so it follows that there is such a thing, and it's the source of all else. And if that's the case, well, then classical theism is true. So classical theism is true. And so here's just from his book where I'm getting this, New Proofs of the Existence of God. He writes that recall from the chapter that an infinite number of conditioned realities without an unconditioned reality is equivalent to absolutely nothing, because without an unconditioned reality, there would be only conditioned realities. This would mean that every conditioned reality, say CR1, would have to depend on some other conditioned reality, say CR2, in order to exist. Hence, it is nothing until CR2 exists and fulfills its conditions. Similarly, CR2 would also have to depend on some other conditioned reality, say CR3, for its existence, and it would likewise be nothing until CR3 exists and fulfills its conditions, and so forth ad infinitum. Since every hypothetical conditioned reality is dependent upon other non-existent conditioned realities for its existence, it will never come into existence. It does not matter whether one posits an infinite number of them, for each one in the series of dependence is still equal to nothing without the reality of the others. But if the quote-unquote others are nothing without others, and those quote-unquote others are nothing without still others, it does not matter if one postulates an infinite number of others or arranges the infinite number of others in a circle. They are all still nothing in their dependence upon non-existent conditions. Therefore, the hypothesis that there are only conditioned realities in quote unquote all reality will always result in all reality being nothing, which is patently contrary to fact, including the fact of the reader's existence. Therefore, there must at least be one unconditioned reality in all reality. Every conditioned reality would have to depend on such an unconditioned reality for the ultimate fulfillment of its conditions. So a bunch of different responses to this. First, there are some sophisticated defenses of you could say metaphysical anti-foundationalism. So Bone, 2010, for instance, writes on infinitely descending ground, and Litlin, 2016, writes on an infinitely descending chain of ground without a lower bound. These are cases where you have a kind of hierarchical infinite chains of dependence, precisely the kinds of chains that Spitzer is trying to rule out up here. And so that's one response that you could take. You could deny that sort of chains of dependence or ground, you can deny that those must necessarily be finite. A second response you could take is that, well, this line of argument is perfectly compatible with non-classical theism as well as non-theistic views, which accept the existence of at least one independent reality. So you could deny premise 6 up here. You could say, no, we agree that there's at least some independent thing. Otherwise, you just have dependence all the way down. But it's not going to have all of these highfalutin properties, as it were. Now, of course, Spitzer has certain arguments for why some of these follow, but at least speaking by my lights, I don't think those are very plausible. Now, what would some of these views look like? Well, you could have an independent, necessary foundational reality. That's foundation to reality. So certain non-theistic proposals could be a collection of Mereological simples. Matteo Bonucci, like, he has his PhD thesis here where he defends this view. It's a collection of Mereological simples. It could be a collection of physical symbols or one or more foundational quantum fields. It could be the universal wave function. There's a huge literature in philosophy of physics on this view called wave function monism. Alyssa Ney published a recent book in 2021 precisely on this, so definitely check that out. It could be the universe as a whole. Dang it, I left a space there. It could be the universe as a whole, like Jonathan Schaffer, if you like, his kind of priority monism. You could have an Oppian initial singularity. You could have a neutral monist substance or structure or structural relations, a la ontic structural realism. You have dynamic physical principles as the ultimate ground. Gunn, I think that's how you pronounce it. He has a 2021 article in Philosopher's Imprint entitled On the Ultimate Origination of Things, where he articulates a view that has the ultimate ground of reality, the necessary foundation, independent foundation, as sort of dynamical physical principles. You could have matter energy and many, many more. There are also, so that was non-theistic proposals. You could also have kind of intermediate proposals, or it depends on your interpretation. So you could have an impersonal, unconscious, or non-intellective, absolutely simple principle or universal source of all, akin to some interpretations or understandings of the Platonian one or Brahman. Again, some interpretations. You could also have theistic proposals, but just non-classical theistic. So you could have an indifferent or aesthetic deity hypothesis, neoclassical theism. I guess I could add deism. Well, deism, neoclassical theism. You could have a view that's really close to classical theism, but that denies only the doctrine of divine simplicity. So you could have timelessness, immutability, and impassibility, but just deny divine simplicity. You could have panentheism, open theism, pantheism, and so on. Okay, so now let's move on to another argument. Juliano on Creatio ex Nihilo, creation ex nihilo. So he has a master's thesis available here that you can read, where he kind of develops this argument for divine simplicity. If God is composed of parts, then God's creative action must be derived from something that is not God, that is, from at least one of God's parts. So one of the motivations for this, I believe, is just that, like, well, if God's not absolutely simple, well, then plausibly God is going to be numerically distinct from his creative act. But then in that case, his creative action is in some sense derived from something that is not numerically identical with God, because God's different from his creative act. And so his creative action, like creation itself, is not out of nothing. It's out of something distinct from God, namely God's creative act. And if God's creative action must be derived from something that is not God, then God cannot create ex nihilo, but he does create ex nihilo. And so it's not the case that God's creative action must be derived from something that is not God, and therefore God is not composed of parts. I was just basing that kind of very informal justification off of memory. So don't like quote me on that. Definitely, if you want to look into this further, read his master's thesis here. So here are potential responses. Why potential? Because I haven't read the whole master's thesis, and so it's epistemically possible that Juliano addresses the points below. So one thing that you could do is you could deny that actions or properties are like parts. This does seem to have that kind of conception of parts at play. And so throughout part one of my video series here, there were a lot of cases where arguments depended on, or at least seemed to depend on, an acceptance of a constituent ontology. But this might be yet another instance of that, where you can get out of the argument potentially by rejecting constituent ontology. A second thing that one might do in response is you could just deny creation ex nihilo. You could go the panentheist route. You see, for instance, Felipe Leon's argument for material causality, which pushes in the panentheistic creation ex deus direction. I did a video with it with Felipe here, and he also did an interview here. You could also argue that the understanding of creation ex nihilo is far too rigid. God can create ex nihilo in the sense that, one, God acts to bring creation into existence, and two, God's act of bringing creation into existence is not some operation on or reforming of some pre-existent stuff. The fact that God is distinct from God's act of creation, and consequently that there is something numerically distinct from God by which creation comes into being, does nothing to compromise the doctrine of creation ex nihilo worth wanting. Indeed, a definition of creation ex nihilo so rigid that requires God to be numerically identical to his act of creation, one might argue, should be rejected for that very reason. You might also argue as a fourth response that the argument is potentially incompatible with Trinitarianism. So consider that every Trinitarian, it seems, has to say that each divine person is numerically distinct from God, since numerical identity is transitive. And hence, if they were each numerically identical with God, they would be numerically identical with one another, which is absurd. But whether the Father or the Son or the Spirit or some combination created the universe, it is unavoidable that there is something numerically distinct from God by which creation comes into being. Now, I had a footnote here, right? So to be sure, you could take a relative identity approach, according to which the following conjunction is possible. X is an F, Y is an F, X is a G, Y is a G, X is one and the same F as Y, but X is not one and the same G as Y. Applying this to God, we would say that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Father is a person, the Son is a person. The Father is one and the same God as the Son, but the Father is not one and the same person as the Son. You could, for helpful exposition by Mike Ray, you can see here. And for an extensive discussion, you can see Dale Tuggy's Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy article on Trinitarianism here, and the references therein to like Pruss, Craig, Leftow, and the gang, who criticized some of whom criticized the relative identity approach. But note again that this relative identity approach, this is not numerical identity, and it is explicit about that. Like the Father and the Son here are still not numerically identical to God simpliciter. They are only relatively identical to God. Okay, so we have, now let's move on to, now let's move on to Pruss's argument from worship. Okay, so this is what Pruss argues. He says, if God were not simple, then sometimes when we worship God, we would be worshiping him on account of some component of God. For instance, we would be worshiping God on account of his mercy, or on account of his justice, or on account of his beauty. Now, we learned in Plato's Lysis that if we love A for the sake of B, then in an important sense, what we really love is B. I propose a weaker analog to this principle. If we worship X on account of Y, then we are thereby worshiping Y. I'm not saying that we don't really worship X. Thus, too, if God is not simple, our worship of God on account of his mercy, say, is worship of a component of God that is not God. But to worship something other than God is idolatrous on uncompromising monotheism. Thus, worship of anything other than God is wrong if uncompromising monotheism is true. However, it is not wrong to worship God on account of his mercy. And so putting 1 through 4 together, we conclude that God is simple, assuming, of course, we have the truth of uncompromising monotheism, which we probably want to have. He defines that in his post here, but you could just read that as just monotheism, like there really is only one God. Okay, so potential responses. Again, potential because I haven't studied this argument in profound depth. So here's the first response that someone could make. There seems to be nothing absurd or immoral for worshiping not only God himself, but also worshiping God for who he is and what he does, right? People worship God for what he does all the time, such as saving the Israelites or redeeming humanity, despite the fact that these are not utterly identical to God himself. There seems to be nothing idolatrous in worshiping God for exemplifying all the great making properties, say. A second response someone might level is that premise 2 smuggles in assumptions concerning what counts as parts that most non-classical theists and most contemporary philosophers would reject. And so you can see the stuff about constituent ontology for a reference. Here is premise 2. Okay, so the third response that one might say is that premise 1 seems quite dubious. Remember, premise 1, if we worship X on account of Y, then we are thereby worshiping Y. No one's worshiping mercy itself, right? They're worshiping the person who is merciful. Like this also ties into priority monism with respect to God, right? Under priority monism, or at least under whole-to-part grounding, I probably should say, not necessarily priority monism, because we're not trying to be like Spinozistic pantheists. So I probably should have just said whole-to-part grounding. Okay, I'm just going to fix that, whole-to-part grounding with respect to God. For under whole-to-part grounding, God's having certain properties is less fundamental than and obtains in virtue of God's simpliciter. And if that's the case, and even if we worship God on account of, say, his mercy, we aren't committing idolatry precisely because God is merciful in virtue of God's simpliciter. Here's a case that seems to be analogous. When Jimmy performs a virtuous action, we praise Jimmy. And this is true even if we praise Jimmy on account of his virtuous action. We aren't thereby praising the action itself, right? Like no one goes around and congratulates or thanks actions. And this is so even if Jimmy is distinct from his virtuous action. We are praising Jimmy and not his virtuous action, even if we praise Jimmy on account of his virtuous action. So I think the non-classical theists could just say, listen, premise 1 is really dubious, and there are analogies that seem to show that it just seems really implausible. Okay, a fourth response, it also might be open to the non-classical theists simply to say that idolatry or improper worship occurs only if the thing being worshipped is extrinsic to God. Like there seems to be nothing immoral or wrong about worshiping either God or worshiping something within God. This particular response is kind of like a bite the bullet response, but perhaps it's not a terribly difficult bullet to bite. And then the fifth thing that I want to say is that this might have, again, like a potential problem for Trinitarianism. So, one rightly worships the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, even though they're numerically distinct from God. So it's false to say that it's wrong to worship something numerically distinct from God. But if it isn't automatically wrong to worship something numerically distinct from God, why would it be wrong for the non-classical theist to worship God's mercy, where God's mercy is numerically distinct from God? Assuming, as I've argued, we probably shouldn't, of course, that Pruss has established that non-classical theists worship God's mercy. Again, see this third point on that particular point. Okay, so that's Pruss's argument from worship. Now on to a Pruss-inspired argument from Transcendence. Again, there's the source. Pruss essentially says if one rejects divine simplicity and holds that God has at least two constituents, his essential nature N and his contingent decisions D, then one has to say something about the relationship between the two. Now, clearly D is in some way explained by N, right? God acts as he does in part because of his essentially perfectly good character. Now, this explanation is not a grounding type explanation, right? Grounding is a necessitating relation, such that X grounds Y only if X entails Y. But whatever is entailed by something necessary is itself necessary, and so because N is necessary but D is contingent, the link is not a grounding one. In creatures, the corresponding explanation of decisions would be causal, right? The character causes, deterministically or not, the decision. That's quite controversial, though, I should add. I think this is me interjecting. Many libertarians deny that our character and our reasons, desires, and so on cause our actions. Rather, the agent causes the actions, and that's where the causal buck stops. So I did find this particular bit weird when I was reading it in Pruss, but anyway, we could set that aside. So it seems that we have something very much like a causal relationship between N and D in the case of God. And this in turn makes D very much like a creature, indeed perhaps literally a creature. Since D is a constituent of God, it follows that a constituent of God is very much like a creature, perhaps literally a creature, but that simply contradicts God's transcendence. No creature can be within God as a constituent. So here are some responses. This is only an argument against the view that God is quote unquote composed of N and D. It doesn't target any other kind of composition, for example, like omniscience distinct from omnipotence. So it won't actually get you to divine simplicity. It's only going to get you even if it succeeds, it's only an argument against the view that God is quote unquote composed of some kind of necessary nature and contingent decisions. But you can totally circumvent the argument if you reject that kind of composition, but you still accept other kinds of composition within God. Composition in the sense that classical theists use it. So, for instance, omniscience being distinct from omnipotence. Secondly, the relationship need be neither causal nor grounding. That's a second response you can make. Like the relationship can be non-causal, reason-based form of explanation akin to final causality, right? God acts for a reason, sometimes called the for relation. That reason enters into, as it were, God's action or decision or intention. It is operative, right? It makes the action intelligible. So, God wills some A for any created effect A for reason R. So R enters into the for relation just in case God takes it that reason is the reason he acts on. So you can just reject the fundamental principle that Pruss is relying on in his argument from Transcendence here, namely that D is in some way causally dependent on N. Okay, so now on to the argument from beginnings against divine temporality. Time to get a drink. Okay, so note that neither of the next two arguments are for classical theism per se, but instead only for timelessness. God could still be passable, have potentials for cross-world variance or quote-unquote change, and be non-simple. Okay, so version 1. So we're going to give probably two versions of this argument. Yeah, okay, so version 1. If God created the universe ex nihilo, then the universe and metric time along with it came into existence a finite time ago. So metric time, that's kind of like ticking time. It's established by some kind of, constant, repeated, rhythmic pattern, like bum, bum, bum. So some kind of like physical change or what have you, or continual change of some kind or another that serves to ground the passage of time. And it's metric. You can sort of measure it. So if God created the universe ex nihilo, then the universe and metric time along with it came into existence a finite time ago. That's typically a core tenet of creation ex nihilo, that the universe came into being some finite time ago. Premise 2, God created the universe ex nihilo, so that a lot of theists as such are going to accept that. So the universe and metric time along with it came into existence a finite time ago. If premises 2 and 3 are true, though, right, if God created the universe ex nihilo and the universe and metric time along with it came into existence a finite time ago, well, then obviously God creatively caused metric time. He caused metric time to exist, to come into being. That's obvious. And so God creatively caused metric time. Causes are or were ontologically or temporally prior to their effects. So listen, causes are in some sense prior to their effects. You don't have to say that they're temporally prior. You can say they're merely ontologically prior. In fact, this argument is trying to conclude to timelessness. And so it's going to say that there is at least one case of causation, namely God's causing the universe, that is merely ontologically prior to its effect, namely, God in his timeless state or whatever. So, but causes are in some sense prior to their effects. They are more fundamental than them. They produce them. They bring them about. So if God is or was prior to metric time, then assuming a denial of full-blown timelessness, either God exists timelessly sans metric time, but temporal since creation, or God existed in a non-metric amorphous time prior to creation, right? Surely these are the only options if you deny full-blown timelessness, that God is both timeless sans creation, that is without creation, and timeless with creation. You pretty much only have two other views, right? God is timeless sans metric time and timeless sans creation and temporal since creation, or else God is always temporal, as it were. And so he's temporal both within creation and prior to creation. And so he'd have to exist prior to creation in a kind of non-metric or amorphous time. You can check out some of my discussions with Ryan Mullins on my channel where he describes this a little bit further, but it's kind of a time that it doesn't have that kind of continual metric going on. It doesn't have that rhythmic ticking. And so you can't say how long it is, but rather it's just this kind of amorphous, it's sort of formless, non-metric time. So this premise I think is reasonably plausible. And so it follows from 5 through 7, God caused metric time and causes are prior to their effects. And if God's prior to metric time, which is one of his effects, well, then assuming a denial of full-blown timelessness, it simply follows that either God exists timelessly sans metric time, but temporal since creation, or God existed in a non-metric amorphous time prior to creation. But God didn't exist timelessly sans metric time, but temporally since creation. And God didn't exist in a non-metric or amorphous time prior to creation. And so it follows that full-blown timelessness is true. So what is the support for this premise 9 that God doesn't exist timelessly sans metric time, but temporal since creation? Well, you can check out the debates that have been going on recently, at least in 2020. So Wielenberg, Craig responds, Wielenberg responded to him, Craig responds, and Jacobus Erasmus responds. Majesty of Reason, that is obviously my channel. Eric Wielenberg came on my channel and we discussed some of this stuff. And Ryan Mullins also responds to Craig's view in a 2020 paper. You actually can find all of this stuff in these links. So again, check the description because this document is in there and you have the links to all of these goodies. You're welcome. Okay, so a second thing that someone might say in support of this claim that God doesn't exist timelessly sans metric time, but temporal sense, someone might say it's borderline unintelligible or that it's extremely counterintuitive, right? And if something seems to be the case, well, then at least a lot of epistemologists think that's prima facie justification for thinking that it is the case. You have prima facie reason to think that it is the case if it seems to you to be the case, absent defeaters, of course. So it's defeasible. But if it does indeed seem if it seems false, if this seems really odd, if it seems to be impossible, if it seems counterintuitive, well, then that actually is some reason to think that it is impossible, that it is false, or that, all these other sorts of things, given this pretty standard view in epistemology. So you can also say, like, in support of this, it's like, listen, like, what does this view amount to? Does God transition somehow from a state of timelessness without creation to a state of temporality since creation? Like, it would seem to be true that God used to exist timelessly, right? Like, God doesn't now exist timelessly. So, like, what's the relationship between, God's timeless phase, as it were, of his life and his temporal phase, as it were? If the timeless phase doesn't still exist, as it were, well, then it seems as though it went out of existence. It used to exist. But then something timeless is standing in a temporal relation, namely being earlier than, or at least in this case, being past. It's no longer the case that God exists timelessly. And so this kind of timeless phase, something timeless, is standing in a temporal relation. And that's absurd, right? Timelessness is sort of characterized by not standing in temporal relations with things. So this is a kind of third support that someone might level in support of premise 9. Okay, yeah, God didn't exist in a non-metric or amorphous time prior to creation. So this is premise 10. What is the support for this? Well, likewise, we can give 3 different supports. So first, or I guess this isn't really a support, the third one. So first, this view does require an absolute theory of time. Absolute theories of time deny the plausible thesis that there is no time without change. That is to say, change is a necessary condition of time. Somehow, and again, most philosophers reject absolute theories of time, which, that's something to really take into account if you're trying to assess the merits of particular views. But yeah, it is difficult to wrap your mind around what would it be without change? Like, there's no change occurring, but somehow there's time, and it's like, and it's weird if you really, really reflect on it. Some people argue. I also raised some potential worries for the view near the end of my discussion with Eric Wielenberg, which is linked here and also up here. Though beware of Ryan Mullins' work in progress, From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker. It promises to be a pretty interesting, pretty good book. So I'm looking forward to that. And so the conclusion follows. So full-blown timelessness is true, or at least if you buy all the premises. So that's version 1. Now let's look at version 2. Okay, so if it is possible that metric time is past finite, then, assuming a denial of full-blown timelessness, either it is possible that God exists timelessly sans metric time, but temporal since creation, or it is possible that God existed in a non-metric amorphous time prior to creation. So this is just basically possibilizing or modalizing the stuff that we said up here. Premise 2, it is possible that metric time is past finite. So that's the second premise. Surely it's within. So again, we're talking to theists here, right? The classical theist, or at least the proponent of timelessness, is trying to convince those theists who don't accept timelessness, full-blown timelessness, that is. They're trying to get them to accept full-blown timelessness. And so again, they're just appealing to these other theists and saying, like, listen, surely you guys also think that time is at least possibly past finite, metric time, that is. So, like, surely it's within an omnipotent being's power, which you already believe in, to make a past finite metric time. Like what? Like God can't do that? Like also various forms of finitism seem to support at least the possibility of the finitude of metric time in the past direction or the earlier than direction. For example, causal finitism and arguments in favor thereof. Now, causal finitism, as Alex and I explained in our video on my channel, it doesn't strictly entail that metric time is past finite. You have a kind of quantifier shift worry there, but it surely does provide evidence in favor of times being past finite. And 840 it's possibility. Okay, so premise 3, it is not possible that God exists timelessly sans metric time, but temporal since creation. So a lot of the arguments up here are just going to be arguments that it's not even possible, right? So it's part of the very nature of being timeless that you're not standing in a temporal relation. And so this would be an argument for impossibility. Similarly, these points up here are trying to pinpoint certain incoherencies. And so again, that would be arguments for impossibility. But similarly, it's not possible that God exists in a non-metric or amorphous time prior to creation. Again, surely if the relational view of time, which is the main opponent to the absolute theory of time, if the relational view of time is correct, surely it's necessarily correct, right? Like these are fundamental foundational features of reality itself. And so surely they characterize the very nature of time, if they characterize time at all. And so if the absolute theory of time is true, it's necessarily true, plausibly. And if the relational theory of time is true, then it's necessarily true. And so all the objections to the absolute theory of time are going to be objections that claim that it's not possible that God exists in this kind of non-metric amorphous time prior to creation. And so from those, it follows that full-blown timelessness is true. Oh, goodness, we have a third version. This is dope. Okay, so version 3. If metric time is past finite, then, assuming a denial of full-blown timelessness, either God exists timelessly sans metric time, but temporal since, or God existed in a non-metric amorphous time prior to creation. Okay, so this is just the non-modalized version of version 2. Metric time is past finite, so God doesn't exist timelessly, blah, 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 sans creation. God doesn't exist in a non-metric time, so full-blown timelessness is true. So this is a modalized, version 2 is a modalized version of version 3. But all three of these versions are kind of getting at the same core. It's kind of like this they're making a point that the universe either is or is at least possibly past finite, and so it is the case, or is at least possibly the case, that metric time began and came into existence. And so God's going to somehow have to be causally prior to that, ontologically prior to that. And how are you going to flesh this out? Well, you're either going to say it's timeless sans creation and temporal since, or you're going to say it's both temporal before and temporal after, or you're just going to say it's full-blown timelessness. And then you're going to argue against those first two views and thereby conclude to the last view, full-blown timelessness. So yeah, anyway, I think that's a really interesting argument, and it's really interesting to think about. And of course, there are like a bunch of responses and whatnot, but let's move on to an anti-Aristotelian argument for divine simplicity. So premise 1, parts are more, so this is again a source from Alexander Pruss's blog. So premise 1, parts are more fundamental than their whole. Nothing is more fundamental than God. So God has no parts. Or another way to put the same point, every whole explanatorily depends on its parts. God explanatorily depends on nothing, so God has no parts. I modalize this as well, so possibly, it's at least possible that parts are more fundamental than their whole, but necessarily nothing is more fundamental than God. Part of what it is to be God is to be the most fundamental thing. There's nothing more fundamental than God. So possibly God has no parts, but if it's possible that God has no parts, then it's necessary that God has no parts. And that's obviously true if you think about it. If it's possibly true that God has no parts, right? So listen, God's a necessary being. So go to that possible world where God has no parts. Well, under the classical theist view of parts, accidents are parts. And so in that view, or in that possible world where God has no parts, it also follows that God has no accidents in that world. That is, no properties that could be otherwise or that he could have failed to exemplify. But in that case, all of his properties are essential in that world. And since essential properties are had by the thing in all worlds, and since God exists in all worlds, right, God's only going to have essential properties in all worlds. And moreover, if he had two such distinct essential properties in that one world, well, then he'd have parts. And so he only has one essential property with which he is numerically identical. And so you just have God there. And in that case, because he, everything has all and only its essential properties in every possible world in which it exists. And it simply follows from that God has only that one essential property with which he is identical in all possible worlds. And so it is indeed true that if it's possible that God has no parts, then it's necessary that God has no parts. That's a bit of a complicated deduction, but this is true. Okay, so here are some responses. You could take a kind of anti-realism about metaphysical parts, a la William Lane Craig. So William Lane Craig says God has no parts at all, but that's just because that there's no such thing as like these things called metaphysical parts, like properties and forms and accidents and essences and so on. So this anti-realism is basically just saying, yeah, I can accept that conclusion, but that doesn't get you to classical theism or even to the doctrine of divine simplicity, because you can deny metaphysical parts, which is kind of like undergirding all the kind of oomph behind the doctrine of divine simplicity. And so even William Lane Craig's God, who is temporal, and or at least temporal since creation, and passable and whatnot, like all these different sorts of things are perfectly compatible with God having no parts at all under William Lane Craig's view, because there are no such things as metaphysical parts. So even if you conclude that God has no parts, that won't really get you to divine simplicity. So this response says. A second response points out that most non-classical theists are just going to reject premise one in both cases, if by part we just mean like positive ontological item intrinsic to but distinct from something, right? They're just going to say, listen, it's just false that parts are more fundamental than their whole. At least in the case of God, God grounds God's parts. God explains God's parts. This was a point that we made in the aseity portion of the earlier video. And so here's a third response. You could, again, adopt whole two-part grounding. So that's kind of playing off that second thing. You know what? I'm just going to do boop. And so we're just going to keep that there. Okay. So the composition-to-contingency argument. I've seen some people in comment sections make this, and it frustrated me enough to include it in here. So premise one, whatever has parts is contingent, that is possibly non-existent. Perhaps the idea is that like if it has parts, well then somehow you can separate them and thereby cause the thing to cease to exist. But premise two, God is not contingent, so God has no parts. Again, another response is just anti-realism a la William Lane Craig. So accepting the conclusion is perfectly compatible with non-classical theist models of God. Another response that you can make is just like premise one just seems obviously false. Like, why should we believe it? Well, is the idea that you can separate the parts and thereby destroy the object? Well, that's just absurd. We know of all sorts of parts that cannot be separated. Like you cannot separate, for instance, a radius from a circumference. They're necessarily co-instantiated. And you cannot separate three-sidedness from three-angledness. And if the non-classical theist God exists, one cannot pull apart, say, God's omniscience from his omnipotence. They're both necessarily co-instantiated and necessarily belong to a necessary being. There are also counterexamples to the principle that whatever has parts is contingent, or at least plausible counterexamples. So like it seems plausible that there are necessarily existent propositions, since some propositions are true in all possible worlds and truth plausibly presupposes existence. See one of Josh Rasmussen's papers, From Necessary Truth to Necessary Existence, on this point. And yet propositions are not absolutely simple, right? They have distinct properties like truth or falsehood and aboutness and correspondence and modal status and so on. So it's just false that whatever has parts is contingent. And so my assessment is like, this is probably the most implausible argument thus far considered, and probably that we're going to consider in this whole document. But I had to, I'm not like attributing this to anyone in particular. I've just seen it in some like internet forums and whatnot. And it just bothered me so much because I thought it was so bad. Anyway, we're moving on. Pruss's finitist argument for the doctrine of divine simplicity. Okay, if God is not simple, well, then he has infinitely many really distinct features. For example, God's knowing P1 will be distinct from God's knowing P2, which will be distinct from God's knowing P3, and so on ad infinitum. But God cannot have infinitely many distinct features. That's finitism. So that basically you're saying, listen, finitism is true, or at least plausible. And so I'm not saying that Pruss is committed to finitism. He's just pointing out that it's a cost of a view if it entails that you have to deny finitism, which is controversial among philosophers. The denial of finitism is controversial. Now, finitism is itself a minority position, but still, if you have to commit yourself in an entirely new domain, entirely different domain, if your model of God, for instance, like committed you to this one particular view in philosophy of mind and this one view in philosophy of time, like those are going to be some theoretical costs. And so similarly, if your view of God, namely non-divine simplicity, views that deny divine simplicity, if those require you to commit to the falsity of finitism, that's going to be probably a theoretical cost for your views. Now, of course, you could just say, screw that, finitism is false. It's one thing you could say. Pruss himself, for instance, doesn't like finitism. He likes calls of finitism, but he doesn't like finitism. So God is simple per this argument here. I think I make two responses. Yeah, so this is highly debatable, to quote Dr. Brown. That's sort of like an inside joke, but yeah, anyway, this is highly debatable, this argument. Like you could see Alston's and Craig's view. They have a view where God's knowledge is in some sense simple. Like God just has one state of knowledge which just comprehends all. It's just like one simple gaze that God sees and knows everything. But that doesn't commit them to like divine simplicity, say. It's just because God's numerically distinct from that knowledge. But the knowledge itself is not like dispersed into infinitely many little subparts or whatever. So they have a view where it's like not the case that you can infer that God has infinitely many distinct features, at least by means of this particular argument up here. And one of their reasons, like one of Craig's reasons, for instance, for thinking that God is going to have to be distinct from God's knowledge, even if God's knowledge is simple, is precisely concerns about contingent knowledge. Okay, so moreover, if one is a finitist, well, then one already thinks that there are only finite. Like, listen, Pruss is trying to show like, there's this kind of tension between finitism and views which deny divine simplicity. But like, listen, if one is already a finitist, then one already thinks that there are only finitely many truths, and hence only finitely many things God knows. And hence, even if God's knowledge of each thing is a distinct feature of God's, or each truth is a distinct feature of God's, well, God will not have infinitely many really distinct features, because again, there are only finitely many such truths. And so even if God's knowledge of such truths, even if they uniquely correspond to some quote unquote part of God or feature of God, it just won't follow that God will have infinitely many really distinct features. So I just don't think this has any bite. This argument, it just doesn't, it does not work. And indeed, well, I could probably separate this as a separate response. There we go. So 3 responses. Here's the third response. Pruss isn't a strict finitist. His argument here is conditional on finitism. Moreover, all he needs is a claim that it's a theoretical cost to have something infinitely complex in one's ontology. I'm recognizing I kind of already said that. Pruss also tries to level a version of the argument on which God's infinitely many distinct features will be reasons, which in turn will jointly cause God's creative act, albeit indeterministically, which violates causal finitism. But you can just reject that reasons are causes. Indeed, Pruss himself suggests this as a line of response in chapter 9 of his Infinity, Causation, and Paradox. Or you could just say that while reasons are causes, there are only finitely many such reasons. After all, that's exactly what a finitist would say. Okay, so here's the source for that. Now on to the Perdurantist argument for timelessness. Okay, so suppose perdurance is true. Perdurance, what is that? That's a fancy name. Why am I using this fancy frickin' vocabulary? Okay, perdurance. That just means that objects persist by being, okay, so excuse me, endurance is the view that objects persist by being wholly located or wholly present at each of the moments at which they exist. So for instance, I, Joe, a concrete object, me, my whole, the whole of me is present at each moment at which I exist. So I don't have these, like, I'm not this extended 4-dimensional worm, as it were, with like temporal parts that are equally actual. No, you're seeing the whole of me right here. You're listening to the whole of me. All of me. Okay, no, okay. Oh gosh. Okay, so suppose perdurance is true. So that's the denial of endurance, right? So things aren't wholly located at all the moments at which they exist. Rather, objects are like 4-dimensionally extended worms. They are extended objects through time. So you're not actually listening to me, Joe, right now. You're listening to a temporal part of the 4-dimensional worm that is Joe, that will hopefully be like 100 years old, maybe, in the future, in like 2100 or whatever. But so anyway, perdurance just says objects persist by having temporal parts at each of the times at which they exist. Okay, so if that's the case, if perdurance is true, well, then God cannot be in time. I think that that's obviously true by my lights. So I think Pruss is onto something here if perdurance is true. For if perdurantism is true and God is in time, well, then God is composed of many, many, many temporal parts, perhaps infinitely many if one or more of the following is true. Namely, time is continuous, such that between any 2 moments of time, there's a another moment of time, or two, the future is endless, right? So if the future is endless, like if there's an infinite afterlife and perdurance is true, well, then God's going to have infinitely many parts, regardless of whether or not time is continuous. Or if the past is beginningless, that will also be the case. So God's going to be composed. But suppose the past is necessarily finite and the future is necessarily finite, and suppose that time is discrete. Okay. Even still, God's going to have like bajillions upon bajillions upon bajillions of temporal parts, because if time is discrete, the smallest moment of time at which things have their temporal parts is probably going to be the Planck second or whatever, or the Planck moment or whatever the hell it's called. And that's like 10 to the negative 43 seconds. So that means in every single second, there are 10 to the 43 of those. That's one followed by 43 zeros. And that's just how many parts God would have in 1 second. And so, yeah, think about the quadrillions upon quadrillions of seconds there are. Anyway, you get the point. So then you can mount the following argument. Premise one, these parts are concrete and presumably not created by God, right? These are like parts of God, right? He doesn't like create his own parts. Like, it doesn't really even make much sense. So there are concrete things other than God that God didn't create. That's pretty bad if you're a theist. There are concrete things other than God that God didn't create. Okay. Premise two, God acts in virtue of the temporal parts acting, right? So like if you think about the four-dimensionally extended worm that is Joe, that thing doesn't like that thing only acts in a derivative manner. It acts in virtue of its temporal parts acting, right? So like that four-dimensionally extended worm isn't itself directly making this video right now. Rather, that thing can be said to make this video right now in virtue of its temporal part, like Joe indexed to, May 2021. That's the thing that's directly and immediately doing the acting. And so similarly, if God is a perdurant worm, you could just get that tattoo. God is a perdurant worm. Okay. Yeah. So if God's a perdurant worm, well, then he's going to have to act in virtue of his temporal parts acting. But then in that case, God's actions are not the fundamental explainers. God's actions don't explain why there is a reality at all, rather than no reality. God's actions don't explain, like, they don't explain miracles. They don't explain, like, that's just absurd. Surely God's actions are the fundamental explainers. Okay, premise three, or not premise three, but this is another point. The temporal parts are all knowing, right? So each of these, it's not like one of the temporal parts is ignorant of some truth, right? So, all the temporal parts of God are all knowing, and so it follows that God's not the only all knowing entity, right? There are these certain temporal parts that are numerically distinct from the Perdurantist worm that is God. These things are all knowing. So like there are bajillions of omniscient entities, and surely you don't want a view that has bajillions of omniscient entities. The temporal parts are also all powerful, right? Each of these temporal parts can do whatever is metaphysically possible, or whatever is metaphysically possible for a being to do, given its nature, or perhaps whatever account of omnipotence you want. So that means that God's not the only all-powerful entity. There are bajillions upon bajillions of omniscient and omnipotent entities. Like, dear gosh. Moreover, the temporal parts are morally perfect. So there are bajillions upon bajillions of morally perfect entities. So these are all surely unacceptable on their own, let alone together. And so I think Pruss is right that you cannot both accept Perdurantism and that God is in time. But Perdurantism, we can further add, is true, say, because eternalism is true, or some other quasi-eternalist view is true, and eternalism very naturally leads to Perdurantism. Eternalism is the view that all times and contents of times are equally actual, and so the natural view there is like, listen, if my whole life, if all of that is actual, well, then it'd be really weird to say that I'm like wholly located at any particular moment. Like maybe only Joe is wholly located at 25 years old, and then none of the other things are Joe. Like, no, that's really weird. And also it'd be really weird to say that Joe is wholly located, like he's like a not only bilocated, but like like bajillions upon located. I'm not. You would have to say that I'm located at each of those little temporal slices, which is really weird. Like, I'm wholly located there, and if that's the case, don't I have like incompatible intrinsic properties? And if, well, then maybe you're gonna have to deny that they're actually intrinsic after all, and you're gonna have to index them to times, which makes them extrinsic, which is really implausible. Like, anyway, the point is just that eternalism very naturally leads to Perdurantism. There's not a strict entailment there. There are endurantist eternalists, but it's a weird view. It's kind of spook, if you ask me. But anyway, we could set that aside. But what really you could say here, you can conclude that God is timeless, because Perdurantism is true. And if Perdurantism is true, God cannot be in time. So God is timeless. Boom, mic drop. But here's the problem, right? The problem is that you can kill 99.999% of germs with this germ blaster. That's not what I want to say. About 99.99, that percent of divine temporalists are presentist endurantists, right? None of them are Perdurantist. Like, I don't know of, you might be able to correct me, but I don't know of a single philosopher of religion or analytic theologian or any philosopher who are divine temporalists, and yet somehow they accept Perdurantism. All of them accept presentism. So anyway, you're really going to have to argue for Perdurantism. You're going to have to like really roll up your sleeves and get into that literature if you want to mount this argument. And again, it should be noted that, okay, I guess I'll make this second point. Like, this is only an argument. I clicked caps lock. This is only an argument. Man, I cannot type. This is only an argument for timelessness, not the rest of classical theism. Okay. So on to Pruss's Mereological. So I don't think that this argument is all that. I mean, like, listen, I agree with him that if Perdurantism is true, then God is timeless. But like, the question is, should this give any weight of a reason, or any, like, should this be significant for divine temporalists? And they're all uniformly presentist endurantists pretty much. So it's kind of like dialectically toothless. But anyway, Pruss's Mereological perfection argument. Okay, so 1, every part of God is perfect. 2, only God is perfect, right? Like, you don't want to say that there is some non-God thing that's perfect. And every part of God is perfect. Like, that seems plausible. What, you want to say that there's some kind of imperfection in God, or like non-perfection? Like, that's weird. That's weird, dude. So it follows that every part of God is God. And so God has no proper parts, namely parts that aren't himself. So divine simplicity is true. Okay, so here are some responses. Plausibly, I think Pruss might actually equivocate on perfect. So by is perfect, he either means is a perfection, like is a great making property or feature, something which is such that it is necessarily better for a being to have than lack, or else he means is like a perfect being, like is a perfect entity in its own right. Now, if we use one sense in premise 1 and a different sense in premise 2, well, then the argument is obviously invalid. Like, that's the fallacy of equivocation. You get an invalid argument. So that means that we have to use the same sense. So suppose that the sense that we're using of is perfect at play is a perfection, that is a great making feature or property. Well, then premise 1 is true, but premise 2 is obviously false, right? By the lights of non-classical theists. Because then you're going to have to say that, oh, only God is a great making property. It's like, what? God's not a property. Like, no, stop. Like, you're spraying water at that point. You're like, shh, no, like, stop. Anyway, suppose, okay, so we already suppose that. So now, okay, so that it's obviously not going to be the case that you can use the disambiguation of is a perfection. So the only other disambiguation, it seems, is a perfect being in its own right, like is a perfect entity of itself. So suppose, on the other hand, that the sense of is perfect at play is a perfect being. Well, then premise 2 is true. God's the only perfect being. But premise 1 is obviously false. Every part of God is not a perfect being or entity in its own right? No, only God is the perfect being, the perfect entity. The parts of God aren't like perfect beings or perfect entities. Like, no. So premise 1 is obviously false, again, by the lights of non-classical theists. And so either way, the argument fails. Another problem pointed out by a commenter on Pruss's blog. So premise 1 could either mean 1 star, every part of God is as good as it is possible for a part of God to be, that is perfect as a part of God, or else 1 star, every part of God is as good as it is possible for anything to be, that is perfect simpliciter. Now, 1 star renders the argument a non sequitur, right? Every part of God is as good. So this is the argument. Every part of God is as good as it is possible for a part of God to be, that is perfect as a part of God. Only God is perfect. So this doesn't follow. So every part of God is God. That just doesn't follow. It doesn't follow from these two premises. It's a non sequitur. So if we disambiguate it in premise 1 with 1 star, you get a non sequitur. 1 star allows the argument to go through, so it's no longer a non sequitur, but it simply begs the question in favor of divine simplicity. No detractor of divine simplicity would ever grant that every part of God is as good as it is possible for anything to be. That is perfect simpliciter, because only God is that. It takes all the perfect, great-making properties together, unified in one God, that you have the thing that it is like that than which none greater is possible. So I also think that this commenter's point successfully shows that the argument doesn't work, as well as my point about the equivocation on perfect. Okay, so Pruss's centrality of life argument. Premise one, it is permissible to center one's life on God's love. To center one's life on anything other than God is idolatry. Idolatry is impermissible. So God is identical with God's love. Okay, so here's the source. So here are some responses. There seems to be nothing idolatrous in centering one's life not only on God himself, but also centering one's life on who God is and what God does, right? Just as people worship God for what he does all the time, such as saving the Israelites or redeeming humanity or whatever, people can likewise center their lives around what God does, like redeem or saving them, say, despite the fact that such acts are not utterly identical to God himself. Second response, it also might be open to the non-classical theist simply to say that idolatry occurs only if the thing being worshipped is extrinsic to God. There seems to be nothing immoral or wrong or impermissible about worshiping either God or worshiping something within God. This particular response is a bite the bullet response, but perhaps it's not a terribly difficult bullet to bite. Maybe it's more like a muffin. Okay, so premise three, not premise three. What am I doing? Like, is my brain turning to mush? No, it's not, because I can still read and I can still talk and I can still think and I can still do philosophy. Okay, so here's the third response, potential problems for Trinitarianism. It is surely permissible to center one's life on the Father, say, or the Son, or the Spirit, even though they are numerically distinct from God. So it's false to say that it's wrong to center one's life on something numerically distinct from God. But if it isn't automatically wrong to center one's life on something numerically distinct from God, why would it be wrong for the non-classical theist to center their life on God's love, where God's love is numerically distinct from God? For the point about the numerical distinctness of the Father and the Son and the Spirit from God, you can see the earlier video as well as the stuff earlier on in this document. Yes, you. Please consider supporting me. This is a short interjection, y'all. Please consider supporting me on Patreon through a one-time donation. It helps me pay college expenses and student debt, and it also encourages me to keep serving people, right, through rigorous, well-informed, love-oriented, and truth-oriented philosophy content. I mean, any amount is appreciated. Like, you can think of it as like a cup of coffee per month, right? Like, you could just give like $2 a month. That would it would make my day. It would make my life. So I spent many hours working on this presentation, this part 1 and part 2 video. In total, it might be like come to 6 hours or something like that. And that's not even counting the arguments, the 2-part series I'm going to be doing on arguments against classical theism. And I'm giving away all the hours for free in order to serve and educate as many people as possible. Indeed, I've given away far more than this presentation alone. I've given access to papers and projects of mine. For example, my Neo-Platonic proof chapter and my Aristotelian proof chapter and all these other sorts of things that took dozens, if not hundreds of hours in total of extensive research and writing and so on to produce. And I've given access to other forthcoming works. For example, Waldrop's and Omar Fakhri's later on in this document on modal collapse for free. I've given these away for free, and these things take hundreds of hours. So this is all meant, again, to serve you in your pursuit of truth and in your understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. If you see value in this, or if you appreciate the work and care and rigor and charity I've put into this and my other content, well, please consider supporting me. And by the way, patrons get lots of dope goodies. It's not like you're throwing away those $2 a month. You get amazing goodies like special access to videos that no one else has access to, videos that are specially made just for patrons. You can vote on content. You can do all sorts of different things depending on your patron level. So yeah, it's all very, very fun and exciting, and you get lots and lots and lots of goodies. And anyway, I try to spoil y'all. So here's a link to the Patreon, and here's a one-time donation or tip. These are going to be in the description as well, but also they're here. And there's that little my love for you. Oh, I love that. Anyway, that's supposed to be up here. I don't know why it got taken down. So that's unfortunate. Oh, no, now I know why, because I didn't center that stuff. Okay, so there we go. It's all there. Okay, Koons's passage of time rendition of the first way. So Thomas Aquinas, so here's the source. So the black here is going to be Koons. This is what Koons is saying, I believe, roughly. And what I am saying is going to be in this kind of reddish, maroonish sort of thing. Okay, so Thomas Aquinas argues in the first way for the existence of an unmoved mover. However, there's an evident gap between such an unmoved mover and God. At the very least, Aquinas needs to show that the unmoved mover is not only unmoved, but absolutely unmovable, not only in respect of the property or causality of a given per se chain of changes, but also in all respects whatsoever. Oh, so okay. So this is me, I think. I think this is me talking. Now, I've argued that the first way fails on account of being unable to bridge this gap and about a half dozen other gaps by itself. It must, for instance, make recourse to the de ante argument, thereby rendering it a parasitic argument, if indeed we take a non-de ante interpretation of Aquinas' first way. So here is Koons. If Aquinas can establish that the unmoved mover or first mover is absolutely unmovable in every respect, then he can conclude that the first mover must exist outside of time, and in order to exist outside of time, the first mover must lack all passive potentiality, that is, be a being of pure act. So I'm going to periodically interrupt this one to this particular argument to level objections instead of piling them up at the end, because it's going to get overwhelming if I did that. So here are my responses to what he has just said here. So as I explained in detail in my chapter on the first way, linked in section 3.5.2.1, even if we grant that the first mover, the source or ultimate explanation of all change, is utterly unchangeable, it doesn't follow that we've arrived at an entire concrete object that is the unchangeable source of all change. For the unchangeable source of all change could be the nature of a necessarily existent but non-purely actual being, like the neoclassical theistic God. This nature, or a collection of essential properties, if we wish to speak that way, would be purely actual, right? It is necessarily actual with no potentiality for change. For the essential properties of a necessary being are themselves necessarily actual, with no potential for variance or change or cessation or coming to be. Thus, so long as the neoclassical theistic God's nature is the ultimate source of all change, we can secure both, one, a purely actual, by which I solely mean actual and devoid of any potential, unchangeable source of all change, and yet two, there is no whole concrete object which is purely actual, since the unchangeable source of change is within a non-purely actual concrete object, namely the neoclassical theistic God. How is that the case? Well, changes in God, like, say, God going from not intending to create to intending to create, if neoclassical theists wish to countenance this as a change, would be accompanied by essential features, would be explained by essential features of God, like God's goodness and God's necessarily being aware of all the relevant reasons for intending as he does. Now, this in turn means that timelessness doesn't follow upon the mere fact that there is an unchangeable source of change, since the neoclassical theistic God, despite having a nature which is unchangeable and purely actual, nevertheless gains and loses various accidental properties and is thereby temporal. It also means that It also means that a purely actual concrete object just doesn't follow, which is what you would really need, and in order for the argument to successfully show classical theism. And remember, this is all granting arguendo, so for the sake of argument, that we've successfully arrived at a single, unchangeable in all respects source of all change, something I certainly wouldn't grant. So you can, again, see the chapter for further characterization, development, and analysis of these points. Also, I mean, like, obviously, given the classical theists' other commitments concerning, say, the essence, existence, distinction, and whatnot, they would reject the views spelled out above, obviously. But that's utterly irrelevant to the present dialectical context and would also render the first way parasitic on something like the Anti-Argument, right? The sole inference with which we are concerned here is whether or not that there is an unchangeable or unmovable source of all change strictly entails that there is an entire concrete object, which is purely actual and timeless. And as I've argued, it doesn't. Okay, so that's a first response to what Koons says here. Now let's go on to a second response. Okay, so here is the second response. Koons is mistaken in saying that timelessness entails pure actuality, that is, being utterly devoid of potency, or at least passive potency. For while timelessness may debar potentials to change from A to B in the actual world, it by no means debars potentials to vary timelessly and eternally across worlds. For instance, God could have potentials insofar as God could be cross-world variant. Suppose, for instance, that God's timeless act of willing the universe to exist is numerically distinct from his timeless act of willing to exist alone in another world. In this case, God is timeless, but nevertheless has potential to vary across worlds. And this is precise, from my limited understanding, this is precisely a view taken by a number of defenders of divine timelessness, like Brian Lefthal, I believe. But do not quote me on that, okay? Okay, so These are my two responses to what Koons said here in trying to situate the argument. So now let's move on to Koons's construction of his passage of time rendition of the first way. Premise one, assume for reductio that the first mover is changeable in some respect. Okay, so it's good that he's assuming this, right? So what you would show if you could get a contradiction from this assumption that the first mover is changeable in some respect, well, then it wouldn't be changeable in any respect. That is to say, it's unchangeable in all respects whatsoever, which, as I pointed out here, and as I pointed out when I was talking about the first way in my part one, and in my own video on the first way, that's like a major problem for it. Okay, so it's good that Koons is, he's well aware of this. So, two, necessarily time passes if and only if change occurs. Okay, so there's going to be a response at this point. Many philosophers will accept premise two, to be sure, right? That's a relational view of time, but many won't. Now, I believe that absolute theories of time are in the minority, but as with all of philosophy, it's not going to be like this uber small minority. There's going to be a significant, faction of philosophers who are defending it. Still not the majority of philosophers, but many won't, right? And so since it requires the necessary truth of a relational view of time and assumes the falsehood of an absolute view of time without demonstrating or justifying a relational view of time, the argument rests on an unjustified assumption. So that's the first response. So many people are just going to get off the boat here. They're like, what the hell, dude? You're taking a relational view of time. I don't accept that. So that's what someone might say. Okay, so premise three, all motion in fact depends on the activity of the first mover, established by the main argument of the first way. Now, my first response to this is that I've actually argued in my chapter, linked in section 3.5.2.1, that this is by no means established by the main argument of the first way. Even granting the success of the various inferential steps therein, all we are entitled to conclude is that each chain of per se changes has at least one first or primary member which is unmoved in respect of the causal power or property of that given chain. It does not follow from this that there is some single first or primary member for all chains of per se changes. Nor does it even follow that a given chain has a single first member from which it derives its change. It could, for instance, derive its change from two primary or first members, each of which is individually insufficient to explain the change, but which jointly cooperate to explain the relevant change. Thus, it is simply false on numerous fronts to say that the first way establishes that all motion, in fact, depends on the activity of the first mover. So we're not off to the greatest start by my lights in this argument, but let's, onward we march. So premise four, if the first mover were changeable in any respect, then it could be in a state in which it failed to cause any motion. Premise five, to be in such a state, namely a state in which it failed to cause any motion, the first mover would have to be in that state for some period of time, since nothing can be in a state in a single instant. Now, my response. So first, this seems dubious. Like, why couldn't it exist in such a state timelessly, right? No one's saying that it's in a single instant, but also it's not over some period of time, because it's not some instant, right? That's time, right? So why couldn't it exist in such a state timelessly? Well, you might just say that this delivers the desired conclusion, right? For then this entity would be timeless and hence unchangeable. But first, I've already argued on numerous fronts that this will be categorically insufficient, both for pure actuality, since timeless things can, in principle, have potential for cross-world variance, and for the inference to a whole concrete object that is purely actual. So this response to my response here won't work. That's the first reason why it won't work. Second reason why this response to my response won't work is that this rejoinder A, right? This rejoinder assumes that such a being couldn't exist timelessly without the universe and temporally with the universe, but yet no justification in the present dialectical context has been given for such an assumption. In fact, we don't even need to say that the first mover exists timelessly sans creation and temporally since creation. We could instead just say that in worlds in which the first mover doesn't cause change, which, remember, that's what we're considering to be in such a state. So in worlds in which the first mover doesn't cause change, it's timeless. And in worlds in which it does, it's temporal. We don't need any spooky transition from timelessness to temporality. That's just me being a little bit cheeky with the use of the phrase spooky. Okay. 6, since all motion, in fact, depends on the activity of the first mover. If the first mover were in a state in which it failed to cause any motion, there would be no change during the period in which it is in that state. If there were no change during that period, time would not pass during that period. If a period has a temporal duration, time must pass during it. There would be a possible state of the world during which time both does and does not pass, but that's a contradiction, so that you get this contradiction from the preceding premises. So the first mover cannot change in any respect. So again, this is Koons's argument. Koons says that the crucial premises are 4, 5, and 6. So we're going to take 5 and 6 first. Okay, so premise 5. To be in a state wherein the first mover fails to cause any change, the first mover would have to be in that state for some period of time, since nothing can be in a state in a single instant. So Koons says that this is based on Aristotle's, I hate that apostrophe there. Now it's fixed. Yeah, you see that difference there? See that difference? It's so much more beautiful. Okay. This is based on Aristotle's resolution of Zeno's paradoxes in the physics. I should have italicized that. In the physics, instants of time are not parts of time. They are only boundaries of such parts. Hence, nothing happens during an instant. Nothing can be in a state of activity or inactivity for only an instant. Instants can only mark the beginning or end of a period of activity or inactivity. So the first response is that this just doesn't even address the point raised earlier about the timelessness sans view, right? Remember the stuff that I raised in response to it? This just doesn't even address that. But secondly, also, you could just simply adopt a different and perhaps better solution to Zeno's paradoxes, right? There's been a lot of work on that since the, 2,500 years since Aristotle purportedly resolved it. So you could potentially take a different and perhaps better solution to Zeno's paradoxes, which allows for time to be composed of instants, thereby obviating the justification Koons proffers for premise 5. Onward, we march to premise 6. Premise 6 says, since all motion in fact depends on the activity of the first mover, if the first mover were, and again, we already saw why this is not established by the first way, but we can set that aside. Premise 6, since all motion in fact depends on the activity of the first mover, if the first mover were in a state in which it failed to cause any motion, there would be no change during the period in which it is in that state. So this is Koons. This depends on a kind of subtraction principle. If all change in the actual world depends on the first mover, and there is a possible state of the first mover in which it would cause no change, then there is a possible world where no change occurs. We can simply subtract the activity of the first mover from the actual world without being forced to add any new source of motion. Now, in response, you could say that this just seems dubious. Like, why couldn't it be the case that in the non-actual world in which the actual world's first mover causes no change, there is nevertheless some other mover which causes change in that world? Like, premise 6 requires ruling this out even in principle, and yet such a ruling out seems inadequately justified. As far as I can tell, it was simply asserted that we can subtract the activity of the first mover from the actual world without having to worry about some other mover causing change in the world that results. There might be some intuitive plausibility to that. I don't quite know, as evinced by this question mark, but I don't have strong intuitions either way here. And insofar as we're relying on a defeasible modal principle applied in a context far removed from ordinary experience about what happens when we subtract things from worlds, and in particular, things like first movers, I doubt we can derive any confident conclusions. We already know our modal faculties are quite impaired, as it were. But anyway, so this is all just to say that even if we granted this step, it's probably going to be highly defeasible and highly, very, very tentative, pretty weak. But again, I don't even think, plausibly, we shouldn't even grant it because it just seems inadequately justified. But, let's move on. So premise 4, if the first mover were changeable in any respect, then it could be in a state in which it failed to cause any motion. So here's what Koons says on behalf of that. Suppose the first mover is changeable in some respect. Why think that it must be changeable into a state in which it would cause no motion at all? Why couldn't it have a nature such as to cause motion in every possible internal state, while admitting of more than one such possible state? There is some plausibility to the idea that the activity of a thing must depend on the thing's internal state, and that this dependence entails that there be some internal state in which no activity would result. However, this seems far from airtight to me. That is Koons himself saying that. So this is me interjecting. Yes, it likewise seems very, very far from airtight to me as well. As far as I can tell, the consequent of premise 4 simply doesn't follow from its antecedent. I'm open to correction, though. It just doesn't follow from the fact that the first mover has at least one potential for at least one change, that somehow it could therefore be in an entire state in which it didn't cause any motion whatsoever. Now, Koons thinks that there's a better strategy for defending premise 4, so he mounts the following argument. It begins with, if something is changeable in any respect, then it lies within time. My response to this just isn't evident. It would require justifying the in-principle impossibility of Craig's timeless sans temporal sense view. For in God's timeless state, under Craig's view, God is nevertheless changeable, right? It's possible that God undergoes some change, namely, once he creates and he steps in time, as it were. But no such justification has been proffered. No such justification for the in-principle impossibility of Craig's view. And yet that's precisely what he would need to proffer in order to establish this premise. So here's the second thing that Koons says in defending premise 4. If a thing lies within time, then its natural activity through time depends on the metaphysically prior passage of time. So this isn't evident either. If we think of time as posterior to change, such that the passage of time is explained by or grounded in the existence or occurrence of change, as Koons' original argument seems to require, well, then the passage of time may very well be metaphysically posterior to the quote-unquote natural activity, for example, changes occurring within or to that thing, in which case Koons' claim would be false. Okay, so here's something else, or here's the third claim that he says in his argument for defending premise 4. This actually isn't a claim, this is a conclusion, an intermediate conclusion. So it is impossible for the activity of something changeable to be the ground for the passage of time itself. Now, my response again is that this conclusion can only be drawn if, contrary to what I've argued, we regard the above two claims as true, which you probably shouldn't. Yet that is exactly what the first mover must do. This is Koons. But again, nowhere has it been shown, and indeed I've argued to the contrary, that the first way establishes that the first mover is the ground for the passage of time itself. Indeed, we haven't even reached a single source of all change, let alone the ground for the passage of time itself. Moreover, suppose we accept Koons' above conclusion that the activity of something changeable couldn't be the ground of the passage of time. Then we may, with equal legitimacy, it seems, simply reason that precisely because the first mover is changeable, it follows that the first mover isn't the ground of the passage of time. Finally, it just seems implausible that the quote-unquote ground of the passage of time could be something utterly unchangeable and timeless. Like, wouldn't the passage of time be grounded in like the actual repeated changes that occur in the created order? Like, sure, God's the ultimate cause of the being of such a created order, but that's not to say that God is the ground of the passage of time. Right? Time passes in virtue of constant repeated changes happening within or to things. End of story, at least on relational views of time, which you'll recall Koons' argument requires. It does not pass in virtue of the unchangeable timeless act of the first mover, or so I would plausibly argue. Hence, he concludes the first mover must be absolutely unchangeable, and I've argued, though, that the steps needed to reach this conclusion just don't work. Okay. So now we're on to, I believe this is pronounced Vecchio, Daniel Vecchio. He's also a friend of mine. Awesome dude. So Vecchio's coconut argument. We're getting quite elaborate here, people. So here's the source, if you want to look at that. I believe that's his blog. Yes, it is. Okay. Premise 1, if God has parts, then either God has an actual infinity of parts or a finite number of parts. God has an actual infinity of parts only if there can be an actual infinity of concreta. He says, given that God is a concrete reality, the parts of God would be concrete realities. Hence, an actual infinity of parts would be an actual infinity of concrete parts. Now, many non-classical theists will simply reject this, like God's parts may simply be abstract particulars, like tropes. No justification has been given for rejecting this view. Third premise, an actual infinity of concreta is impossible. That's highly dubious. You can see this playlist of videos I've done on the Kalam and the actual infinite. But yeah, this premise is quite dubious. Here's a little cheeky argument against that. So plausibly, is there a number between 5 and 7? yes, surely there's a number between 5 and 7, namely 6. But if that's the case, well, then there is such a thing as 6, in which case 6 exists. And you can run this argument for all the natural numbers, and they're all distinct from one another. And so there exists an actual infinity of things. I know these aren't concrete objects, but if you can have an actual infinity of abstract objects, why couldn't you have an actual infinity of concrete objects? Anyway, that's a really cheeky argument, and I'm not claiming I accept that. I was just doing that for the fun of it, guys. Stop making fun of me for, taking, ordinary language and reading ontological commitments off of it. Okay, I know just because you prima facie have an ontological commitment to the existence of numbers, you might be able to paraphrase that away. But anyway, nominalists, boo, go away. I'm kidding. We love you here, nominalists. Anyway, premise 4, God has a finite number of parts only if a finite amount of coconut trees on an island doesn't prevent it from being a maximally great island. So again, this is what Vecchio says, a common objection to Ganilo's lost. I've heard some people say guanilo. Now that's really weird because the A is before the U. So why would it be guanilo? Surely it's Gaunilo. Anyway, I'm pronouncing it as Gaunilo. So a common objection to Ganilo's lost island one that I think is quite right, is that an island cannot be maximally great since it must have a finite number of some constituent parts, for example, coconut trees or island beauties, but the addition of one more part would be greater, so finite parts are incompatible with maximal greatness. It would seem that more parts of the intellect, more intellects, more wills, more love between more persons of the Godhead would increase God's greatness. But then a God with parts cannot be maximally great for the same reason an island, pizza, or human cannot be maximally great. Prima facie, and absent any reason to think otherwise, it is reasonable to think that an addition of at least some of the finite sets of divine parts would make a non-simple God greater, which is to say that a maximally great non-simple God is impossible. Now, by my lights, this is just unconvincing. If God is perfect, the greatest possible being, then the finite number of God's parts is as perfect as it can be. It is the axiologically greatest possible number and character of parts. And this is all assuming that, God has a finite number of parts, right? If God has a finite number of parts, then, such and such. So, but again, the finite number of God's parts is as perfect as it can be. It is the axiologically greatest possible number and character of parts. That's what it means for God to be perfect. But this is clearly relevantly different from coconuts. There simply is no axiologically greatest possible number of, say, coconuts. Something I will grant Vecchio is that it is a theoretical cost to have some finite number of parts, since it will add a level of arbitrariness and specificity to your hypothesis, which will plausibly decrease its probability. And again, this is all granting Vecchio the constituent ontology in which his argument is plausibly situated. That's another potential mode of criticism that the non-classical theists can level towards Vecchio's argument, for they may very well accept a relational ontology, or, following Craig, might simply embrace anti-realism. Premise 5, a finite number of coconut trees on an island prevents it from being a maximally great island. Like there just doesn't seem to be a finite number of coconut trees or island beauties that would be consistent with an island being maximally great. And so overall, I agree with this premise. And so therefore God has no parts. But I don't agree with the argument as such for the reasons that I've articulated in these points, these red points. Okay, so now we're on to explicability. So we just got past the other section, but now we're on to the explicability section. So this is actually my argument for classical theism. Yes, I've leveled an argument in favor of classical theism and I made it public. Okay, so you can so anyway, here are the explicability arguments. So for any fact F, probably F has some explanation, other things being equal, right? I mean, just think about it. Facts in general have explanations. If you encountered some fact, like the fact that there is some glowing slime on your kitchen counter, facts generally have explanations. And so you have a good reason, absent some defeater, to think that this glowing slime has some explanation. And by explanation, we just mean a non-circular explanation, like something outside of it that accounts for it, and why it's there. After all, if you're trying to explain why the green slime is there on your kitchen counter, it's not going to be explanatorily illuminating to say, oh, why is it there on the kitchen table? Because it's there on the kitchen table. What? No, you didn't explain anything. So yeah, anyway, explanation here, when we're talking about explanation, we're talking about a non-circular explanation, an explanation outside the thing in question or external to the thing in question. So not the fact F itself. It's a fact distinct from it. So for any fact F, probably F has some explanation, other things being equal. It is a fact that there are beings of type T, like changeable beings, composite beings, beings with essence, existence, distinctions, and so on. So probably that there are beings of type T has an explanation, other things being equal. But the only thing that could explain why there are beings of type T, right, why there are changeable composite beings with essence, existence, distinctions, and so on, is going to be in terms of an unchangeable, absolutely simple being in which essence and existence are identical, right? Remember, explanation, as we're operating on it here, is non-circular. Whenever you encounter a fact, you have a defeasible reason to think that the fact has some non-circular outside explanation until you're given sufficient reason to think otherwise. And so any explanation of why there are changeable beings at all, or composite beings at all, or beings with essence, existence, distinctions, couldn't be in terms of one of those very beings, because that just presupposes the instantiation of the type. You're not giving an explanation of the instantiation of the type. You're presupposing the instantiation of the type. And so the only thing that could explain why there are beings of type P is an unchangeable, absolute simple being. So probably there is such a being, all other things being equal. And if it's probable that there is such a being, then it's probable that the classical theistic God exists. So probably the classical theistic God exists, other things being equal. So what are some responses to this? Well, arguably the same arguments are going to be open to non-classical theists. You could let the type T be non-perfect beings, and you could just equally run the argument for a perfect being. And the classical theist can say, listen, I'm using the exact same argument to get to a perfect being, and the perfect being is going to be the neoclassical theistic God. So, and if neoclassical theism is true, then classical theism is false. So they can, they might just be able to mount the exact same argument against classical theism, perhaps. Now, this is the response that I take, certainly. Well, not the response. It's one of the responses that I take. I mean, some of these other responses I might take. I mean, I wouldn't take this one here, but I might take both the first and the second. But I'm going to say that ceteris ain't paribus. Like, all of the things are not equal, right? We probably. So what you need here is you needed like some kind of independent reason to think that there's going to be no explanation, and that could be that. Well, the only explanation is in terms of the classical theistic God, but here are some reasons against the classical theistic God. So we have some independent reason for thinking that this general probability that things have explanations, why this doesn't apply in this case. And so, yeah, anyway, that's the second response, that's a ceteris paribus. I know people say ceteris paribus, but again, that's one of those cases where I'm just like, that sounds like nails on a chalkboard to me. It's like Vallicella. It's like, ugh, it's Vallicella, it's ceteris paribus. Anyway, oh yeah, so the third thing is that this assumes the irreflexivity of explanation. That is to say, it assumes that nothing can explain itself. Yeah, anyway, then again, I think you could just stipulate that explanation is irreflexive and the argument will get off the ground, right? Like, in general, for any fact F, like, yeah, we have a general defeasible rule of thumb that fact probably has some non-circular explanation, some outside explanation, some irreflexive explanation. But also explanation is probably irreflexive. So anyway, I articulate this argument in my video, Why Am I Agnostic? Here is the video. And now it's time for a drink. I need that H2O, my dudes. Okay, now we are on to ontological arguments. So here's one of Vecchio's ontological arguments from Pure Actuality. Maybe it's for Pure Actuality, but I think it just says, oh, no, it is from Pure Actuality. You can see in the hyperlink. So from Pure Actuality. So definition. I guess I'm going to separate this. So God is the being of pure actuality. Okay, so premise one, for all x, if x exists in the intellect but not in reality, then there is a y such that x is causally dependent on y. Vecchio says that this premise is motivated by the fact that if something exists in the intellect alone, then its existence is causally dependent on some mind. Okay. Conclusion. So if God exists in the intellect, this is just a substitution instance. So if God exists in the intellect but not in reality, then God is causally dependent on something. For all x, if x is a being of pure actuality, then there is not a y such that x is causally dependent on y, right? Listen, if something is causally dependent, then it has some potency actualized by another. But whatever is purely actual has no potency. Hence, whatever is purely actual is causally independent. So God is not causally dependent on something, follows from definition and P1. So it is not the case that God exists in the intellect, but not in reality. That's C1 and C2. So, right, if you have not the case that God exists in the intellect, but not in reality, that's just logically equivalent to, so either God doesn't exist in the intellect or God exists in reality. But God does exist in the intellect, right? Even the fool, as it were, understands God as a being of pure actuality, or that in which none greater can be conceived in the case of Anselm, but here it's the being of pure actuality. Now, come to think of it, maybe a lot of classical theists would reject this. Like, no, we actually don't have like a concept of God. Like, you could take a pretty apophatic approach to God. Like, no, God is so transcendent so as to even transcend our concepts, right? We don't have this kind of concept of God as, pure actuality. Like, he is so supreme, so beyond us, so transcendent that he doesn't even exist in our intellect. So I guess that's one thing that you could say. So therefore, God is in reality. So here are some responses. I don't claim Vecchio is unaware of these, by the way. He's an intelligent, reflective guy. He and I are pals. He's a great dude. But these are responses I'm going to give here, at least to help you guys think critically about these things. So first, listen, the ontological argument. So I guess one of the responses that I don't even think I included it as a response under here, but it is another response, is that you could probably have an apophatic rejection of premise 3. And a lot of people might argue that kind of apophaticism is going to be required by classical theism. Some people might argue that, following perhaps like people like Maimonides, who's a Jewish philosopher, medieval period. Anyway, the ontological argument literature is vast, and many of the objections raised therein will likely apply to any classical theism distinctive ontological argument. You can see, for instance, my video with Tyrone. I know it's Tyrone, okay, but I want to say Tyrone, okay, but I know it's Tyrone Goldschmidt on ontological arguments. He has a recent book with Cambridge Elements. It's such a good book. It's super cheap. Go get it. Go buy it. Believe me, folks, it's the best book in the world. Okay, believe me, folks. It's a small load of $1 billion. Okay. Anyway, and also see the description for the best academic resources on the ontological arguments. So the description of that video, that is. So I have references to the best books that you can get on the ontological argument from Api Nagasawa and so on. So the second response is going to be a parity argument. Okay, so we're going to define Fred as an essentially causally independent unicorn. Premise 1: for all x, if x exists in the intellect but not in reality, then there is a y such that x is causally dependent on y. That's Vecchio's first premise. So this is just a substitution instance of that. So if Fred exists in the intellect but not in reality, then Fred is causally dependent on something. For all x, if x is causally, for all x, if x is an essentially causally, what am I doing? If x is an essentially causally independent unicorn, then there is not a y such that x is causally dependent on y. That's obviously true. If something is essentially causally independent, then it's not causally dependent on something. That's obviously true. Okay, so it follows that Fred is not causally dependent on something. That follows from the definition of Fred and premise 1. Maybe that should be. Is that premise 2? It's probably premise 2. Anyway, I'll just put that as premise 2. I don't know if that was my own rendition fault or if that was the fault of Vecchio's source. We're just, who knows? It's probably me. But anyway, I fixed it now. Did I? Yeah, okay. Sweet. Now we're back. We're back, people. Okay, so C3. So it is not the case that Fred exists in the intellect, but not in reality. That follows from C1 and C2, right? If Fred exists in the intellect but not in reality, then Fred is causally dependent on something, but Fred is not causally dependent on something. So it's not the case that Fred exists in the intellect but not in reality. So either Fred doesn't exist in the intellect or Fred exists in reality. But Fred exists in the intellect, right? Even the fool who doesn't believe in Fred understands Fred, and what is understood exists in the intellect. So Fred is in reality. Bada bing, bada boom, there are unicorns. I almost said the B word, but okay. That would have been not PG. Okay, so you might try to say that there's something wrong with like the concept of an essentially causally independent unicorn. Like maybe a unicorn is like by its nature and essence existence composite, and these things are dependent and whatnot. But like, okay, so now you want to make your argument, parasitic on the Dante argument. Okay, we can talk about that if you want, but now it's a parasitic argument. Now let's go back and talk about the Dante. Or you could say, oh, well, whatever is an whatever is an act potency composite, which a unicorn would be, say, that would be dependent. Like, okay, if you want to go and talk about the Aristotelian proof, we can. But this is supposed to be an ontological argument. Or, you might just say, like, so you could just, say, oh, well, there's something wrong with this definition of this concept or something. But prima facie, this does seem to be a parody anyway. But again, I'm not claiming that Vecchio is unaware of this sort of thing. And I mean, listen, the non-classical theist is going to say there's something wrong with this definition. Anyone who isn't already convinced of classical theism is going to say that classical theism is necessarily false. And so there's such a being is impossible. And so you're defining something that's impossible. I mean, sure, you could do that. Like, yeah, we have definite like a square circle. Yeah, we can define that and whatnot. But, there might be something just as wrong with your definition here. So that's what the non-classical theist will say to that probably too. But anyway, the parody, it's interesting because, well, anyway, it's fun to think about the kind of parodies. Now, also, an exactly parallel argument can be employed for neoclassical theism, which is incompatible with classical theism. And so the argument fails to establish classical theism. We're going to define the neoclassical theistic God as a perfect being. The perfect being. Now, the is justified because being the ultimate cause or ground of all else is a perfection, and this entails uniqueness, since if there were two, they would cause or ground each other, which is absurd, since causation or grounding is asymmetric. And this also entails that the neoclassical theistic God is causally independent. So then you could just run the argument, right? For all x, if x exists in the intellect but not in reality, then it's causally dependent. But so if the neoclassical theistic God exists in the intellect but not in reality, then such a God is causally dependent on something. But if something is a perfect being, then we just saw above that it's not causally dependent, and so it's not causally dependent on something. But then it follows that it's not the case that the neoclassical theistic God exists in the intellect but not in reality. But obviously, the neoclassical theistic God exists in the intellect. Even the fool understands it, and so neoclassical theistic God is in reality. So you can establish neoclassical theism by means of this. And so that would, it's clearly a problem for classical theism because the two are incompatible. Here's the fourth thing. Premise 3 is false. This is a fourth response that someone could say. So I'm not like here leveling the, well, you know, sometimes I'll defend them, but like I said, merely presenting something doesn't automatically mean that I am endorsing it. But, you know, oftentimes I'm presenting these and endorsing them, but not all the times. You can't merely assume it. So premise 3, so this response says, so this fourth response says, is false. Let's go back to premise 3 if I can find it. P3, God exists in the intellect. Okay, so that's premise 3. God doesn't exist in the intellect. Maybe my concept of God exists in my intellect, but God himself, no one who doesn't already accept the conclusion would ever grant that God himself, the creator and sustainer of the universe, the perfect ultimate reality, like literally exists in my intellect. Like, what? Like, no. The atheist is going to say, no, God doesn't exist at all. Simpliciter, nowhere, nada, bada bing, bada boom, zilch, la, nah, nil. So there has been sustained criticism in the literature of the whole notion of this existing in the intellect. You can see, for instance, Tyron's book and the references therein. But anyway, that's probably another big problem for the argument. In addition to the apophatic rejection of premise 3, I'm just going to add that here. Apophatic rejection of premise 3. Okay, so Vecchio's Thomistic modal argument. Okay, so here's the source. Premise 1, possibly there's an absolutely metaphysically simple being. Necessarily, that there is an absolutely metaphysically simple being implies that there is a maximally great being. If it's possible that something is maximally great, then it's possible that necessarily there is an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent being. So there is an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being. Defensive premise 1, an absolutely metaphysically simple being, insofar as it is being, is attributed positively and cannot contain a part that negates its essential nature, which means it does not contain incompossible properties or attributes. Okay, so here's my response to that. This ignores the distinction between properties / attributes on the one hand and predicates on the other. For while this simple being doesn't have a multiplicity of attributes, it is nevertheless true that a multiplicity of predicates, for example, omniscient, omnipotent, ase, necessarily existent, morally perfect, loving, merciful, just, and so on, are true of God. And this multiplicity of predicates may very well open the door to internal incompossibilities. Thus, merely ruling out the possibility of incompossible attributes won't work. Okay. Second, there are other ways that something can be impossible. That is, there are ways something can be impossible without there being internal incompossibilities between its attributes. For instance, something's obtaining could contradict one or more necessary truths. Okay. So Vecchio then goes on to say, moreover, since that is the ground of all contingent facts, an absolutely metaphysically simple being cannot be inconsistent with any possible contingent fact. So what I say here is like no one who doesn't already accept the existence of a simple being would grant that the simple being is the ground of all contingent facts. Like I don't quite know where he got that particular point. So thus there could easily be contingent facts that are inconsistent with a simple being. For example, perhaps contingency implies contingent intrinsic items within anything which is omniscient. So anything that knows the contingent facts. Or perhaps contingency is incompatible with a provident, intentionally acting, absolutely simple being, or whatever, right? I'm going to talk about a lot of this stuff in section 4.2 on modal collapse arguments. So Vecchio's defense of premise 2, he cites Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, but Vecchio himself gives no defense of the inferences from simplicity to the various attributes. It's an open question whether Aquinas' inferences all succeed, and I don't think they do. It would, however, take me tens of thousands of words to proceed through the relevant sections of the Summa and address all such inferences here. Defense of premise 3, this implication follows from planning of stipulative definitions of maximal greatness and maximal excellence with a slight deviation from moral perfection to omnibenevolence, divine and Thomistic terms. So this is an analytically true implication. Another response, you might just be able to like level at this argument, like possibly there is no absolutely simple being, in which case you can get the conclusion that there is no such being, just like the ontological argument. And now we're into the symmetry problem, and you're going to have to find some kind of symmetry breaker that doesn't also apply in the other direction and all sorts of different things. So anyway, I don't have, I'm not very positive about the prospects of this particular argument. But again, I'm always open to changing my mind and whatnot. Okay, it should be noted also that almost all the predicates that are applied to the classical theistic God are just correspond to properties and attributes in the neoclassical theistic God. And so if there were some incompatibility within the properties and attributes of the neoclassical theistic God, well, then probably there's also going to be some incompatibility of the predicates that are supposedly, truthfully, and essentially predicated of the classical theistic God. And since Vecchio's argument requires it to be the case that there are no such incompatible predicates applied to the classical theistic God, it would simply follow from Vecchio's own argument that the properties and attributes of the neoclassical theistic God are not themselves internally incompatible or inconsistent and whatever. And so by his own reasoning, that would like favor its own metaphysical possibility, in which case you can like argue for neoclassical theism via this argument. And neoclassical theism is incompatible with classical theism. And so you get an argument against classical theism. So that might be another way to go. I just kind of thought of that on the spot, but it's really interesting. That's like a really interesting response. So I'm just going to put down here, third, it potentially raises an argument. I cannot type today, by the way. Raises an argument against classical theism. All right, now on to Nemes's. That's a great way to pronounce it. Nemes's, love it. Phenomenological ontological argument for pure actuality. Here's a source. Is that the capturing? I think this is a capturing Christianity debate. So there are two presuppositions of his phenomenological ontological argument for pure actuality. Poepa. I like that. Poepa. Okay, so first, contradiction entails impossibility. I agree with that. Sorry, Graham Priest. You'd beat me in all the kind of logical stuff, like you're smarter than me and all that. But I still think that contradiction entails impossibility. Anyway, second, the intentionality of consciousness means that thought is in immediate contact with its object. Now, I think that this is dubious. And again, I'm not claiming that Nemes is unaware of this, but it's dubious by my lights. Consider thoughts about fictional objects like unicorns, Sherlock Holmes, philosophically informed new atheists, and Harry Potter. Here, the objects of our thought are presumably such that we are not in immediate contact with them, since there are no such things, right? I mean, like if I told you that I could be in contact with what is it, Zeus? You'd probably be like, what? No, there is no such thing as Zeus. And so you're not in contact with Zeus, let alone immediate contact. Anyway, I don't claim Nemes is unaware of this. Remember, there will be responses and responses to those responses and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so premise one is not consistently thinkable that pure actuality is not actual. Since apparently this follows from the second presupposition, and since actuality is constitutive, that is part of the very definition of pure actuality. So it follows that it is not possible that pure actuality is not actual. From the first presupposition, so it is necessary that pure actuality is actual, which is just to say that pure actuality exists, that it's actual. Here are some responses. First, the neoclassical theist can run exactly the same argument. Necessary existence, that is to say necessary actuality, is constitutive of the definition of the neoclassical theistic God, in which case we can get premise one, it is not consistently thinkable that the necessarily actual God of classical theism is not actual. Second presupposition, and since necessary actuality is constitutive, that is part of the very definition of the neoclassical theistic God. So it is not possible that the necessarily actual neoclassical theistic God is not actual. First presupposition. So it is necessary that the neoclassical theistic God is actual. So again, it wouldn't distinctively support classical theism over neoclassical theism. And secondly, this argument cancels out the first argument, like dialectically and epistemically, because an argument for neoclassical theism is ipso facto an argument against classical theism. Here's a parody. So define Fred as the actually existent unicorn. It's not consistently thinkable that Fred is not actual. Second presupposition, and since actuality is constitutive, that is part of the very definition of Fred. Look, part of the very definition, actually existent unicorn. So it is not possible that Fred is not actual. So it is necessary that Fred is actual. Now you might respond, oh, well, Fred, unlike pure actuality, is a this such. That actuality is not a part of the definition of any this such, is why it is not a contradiction to say that Fred is not actual. But that's the very question at issue. One could equally legitimately say, au contraire, like, I don't even know, au contraire, right? That it is a contradiction to say that the really existent Martian is not really existent, is why existence is part of the definition of the really existent Martian, right? We have specified a scenario that is precisely one in which actuality or existence is constitutive of the this such, namely Fred, the smallest really existent Martian, and so on, like these sorts of examples. The above response has been, oh, that can't be since actuality is not constitutive of it. Yeah, that's literally the very question at issue, okay? So let's not beg the question. Okay, the third problem, so the second problem was a parity, I think, parity argument. The third problem is, it seems plausible to me that it commits the de re, the dicto fallacy. Man, I need a drink. Someone get me some water, please. Okay, so yeah, plausibly commits the de re, de dicto fallacy. I hope I'm recording. Yes, I am. Okay, so this is the distinction, de re versus de dicto. It's the distinction between necessity of the thing versus the necessity of the statement. Okay, so let's consider some de re necessities. Joe is necessarily human. That is true, right? I am necessarily human. That is to say, Joe is essentially human, right? I couldn't not be human. So note that this doesn't entail that. Okay, so this is really important, guys. Note that this does not entail that necessarily Joe is human, right? This is really, really important to see. Okay, for then it would be true in all possible worlds that I am human, right? That's what this is saying. This is saying in every single possible world, in any way the world could be, Joe is human. But no, that would entail that it's true in all possible worlds that I am human, in which case I would exist in all possible worlds, since I cannot be anything, let alone be human, if I don't exist. But I don't exist in all worlds, right? I'm a contingent being. And so all it means when we say that Joe is necessarily human, all it means is that necessarily, if Joe exists, then Joe is human. That is to say, it cannot be the case both that Joe exists and Joe is not human, right? So necessarily, if Joe exists, then Joe is human. But it's not saying that it's like necessarily the case that Joe is human, because that's a necessity of the statement. Whereas this is talking about necessity of the thing itself, like necessarily if Joe exists, like if that thing exists, well, yeah, then automatically that thing must be a human, like essentially. But we're not saying that that statement, Joe is human, is necessarily true, because then that would be true in all possible worlds, in which case it corresponds to some worldly fact in all possible worlds, namely my being human in all possible worlds, which requires me and my humanity and whatnot, in which case I'd be a necessary being. Now, like de dicto necessity, like for instance, necessarily God exists. You're saying the proposition that God exists is necessarily true in all possible worlds. God exists. Also, necessarily two even numbers add to make another even number, right? That's a necessity of the statement. It's necessarily true that two even numbers add to make another even number. It's a necessity of the statement as a whole. Now, all Nemes has shown is that the proposition that pure actuality is necessarily actual, right? That's a kind of de re necessity, right? That's all he's shown, that pure actuality is necessarily actual. He has not shown that it is necessarily the case that pure actuality is actual. That's a de dicto necessity. The former only means necessarily if pure actuality exists, then pure actuality is actual. But that's perfectly compatible with the antecedent being necessarily false, right? It could be part of the very essence or nature of a purely actual thing to exist. But all that means is that necessarily, if pure actuality exists, then pure actuality is actual. Just as it being part of the very nature of me that I'm human only means that necessarily, if Joe exists, then Joe is human. That's all that definitions can get you. And so, really, from like that definition and from the fact that actuality is constitutive of pure actuality, you can only get this de re claim, this de re necessity, not this de dicto necessity. I will conquer you, de dicto. The former, yeah, again, okay, the former only means necessarily if purely actuality is actual. If pure actuality exists, then pure actuality is actual, but this is compatible with the antecedent being necessarily false. So consider, right? So I know this is kind of like an abstract point, but consider. Fido, the dog, is by definition an animal. In other words, Fido is necessarily an animal. Now consider the following argument, right? So we're going to try to mount this argument that Nemes is mounting, and we're going to do it with Fido, the animal. So it is not consistently thinkable that Fido is not an animal, right? Because animality is constitutive of, that is part of the very definition of Fido. So it is not possible that Fido is not an animal, So it's necessary that Fido is an animal. Now, premise 3 actually entails that Fido is a necessary being, since Fido is an animal in all possible worlds, which clearly entails that Fido is in all possible worlds, right? You can't be an animal if you aren't like being in all possible worlds. Because again, this is the necessity of the statement. It's necessarily the case that Fido is an animal, that is true. The problem really here is an ambiguity in Fido is not an animal, right? So this could mean either it is not the case that Fido is an animal, or Fido is a non-animal, okay? So A, it is not the case. Man, why do I always do this? It is not the case that Fido is an animal, which is there does not exist an X such that X is Fido and X is an animal, or versus B, right? Fido is a non-animal. There actually exists an X such that X is Fido and X is not an animal, okay? It's a non-animal. So asserting B is indeed a contradiction, since Fido is a dog and hence is an animal, and hence B says Fido is both an animal and a non-animal, really. But asserting A simply isn't a contradiction. All it says is that there's no such thing as Fido, right? You're simply just saying it's not the case that Fido is an animal. So if we use A, then premise 1 is false. Suppose then that we use, okay, so premise 1 is, listen, premise 1, remember, it is not consistently thinkable that Fido is not an animal. If we use A, it's not consistently thinkable that it is not the case that Fido is an animal. That actually is consistently thinkable. That's obviously consistently thinkable. You can consistently think that it's not the case that Fido is an animal. There does not exist an X such that X is a Fido and X is an animal. Maybe Fido just died, right? It might be sad, but it's certainly consistently thinkable that it is not the case that Fido is an animal, okay? In which case premise 1 would be false under that disambiguation. So we can't use A if we want Nemesh's argument to succeed. So suppose then that we use B. 1, it is not consistently thinkable that there exists an X such that X is Fido, and it's not the case that, and Fido is a non-animal, right? So it is not possible that there exists an X such that X is Fido and X is a non-animal. So it is necessary that there does not exist an X such that X is Fido and X is a non-animal. But 3 doesn't have any ontological commitments whatsoever, right? You're just saying that it's necessarily the case that there is nothing of which it is true that it's both Fido and a non-animal. That's all you're saying. That doesn't have any ontological commitments. Now we can apply all of this to Stephen's argument. Pure actuality is, by definition, actual. In other words, pure actuality is necessarily actual. Now consider again Nemesh's argument. It is not consistently thinkable that pure actuality is not actual, since actuality is constitutive, that is part of the very definition of pure actuality. So it is not possible that pure actuality is not actual. That's the first presupposition. So it is necessary that pure actuality is actual. The problem, as with the case of Fido, is an ambiguity in pure actuality is not actual. It could mean either C or D. C, it is not the case that pure actuality is actual. That just means there does not exist an X such that X is pure actuality and X is actual. D, pure actuality is non-actual. This is the other disambiguation, which just says that there actually exists an X such that X is pure actuality and X is not actual. Now, asserting D is indeed a contradiction, right? Since pure actuality is by definition actual, and hence D says that pure actuality is both actual and not actual. But asserting C simply isn't a contradiction. All it says is that there's no such thing as pure actuality. It simply says there does not exist an X such that X is identical to pure actuality and X is actual. If we use C, then just as earlier, premise 1 is false, because it is consistently thinkable that it is not the case that pure actuality is actual. Suppose then that we use D. It is not consistently thinkable that there exists an X such that X is identical to pure actuality and X is not actual. So it's not possible that that's the case. And so it's necessary that there doesn't exist such a thing. But again, 3 doesn't have any ontological commitments whatsoever. And so we don't have actually an argument for pure actuality. The general lesson is that a definition of X is just something like, if X exists, then X is essentially such and such. Or in other words, necessarily, if X exists, then X is such and such. There's still the further question of whether anything answers to X in reality. That is, it's an open question whether the antecedent is satisfied. It doesn't follow from the fact that F is part of the definition of X that it is not the case that X is F is contradictory, even if F is existence, since the definition may simply not successfully refer to anything. Consider, for instance, the smallest really existent Martian. By definition, that's really existent. Still, there is no such thing. So see, for instance, Graham Oppy's Stanford Encyclopedia article on ontological arguments. All right, on to closing the gap problem. So these are arguments for classical theism that are essentially trying to say like, hey, we've just arrived at a necessary being by some other argument, and we're going to try to close the gap problem by distinctively arguing that any such being must be the God of classical theism. So suppose we've established that there is some necessary being or beings that is or are the explanation of the realm of contingent beings. Now, again, note that many of these are addressed towards people who already think that God, a unique, unlimited, perfect source or first cause of all else, exists. So they aren't arguments for classical theism per se, like simpliciter, but really arguments against non-classical theistic models of God. So here's Koons. He says that God is identical to God's nature. So here's his argument. If a thing X has a nature Y, then Y is in some sense a cause or ground of X's being as it is. So if God has a nature, then that nature is in some sense a cause of God's being as he is. There is no cause of God's being as he is, so God does not have a nature. Every concrete thing either has a nature or is identical to its own nature, so God is identical to his own nature. Now, this will be thoroughly unconvincing for non-classical theists. God's being as he is does not have a cause, but it does have a ground, God himself. This is the whole-to-part grounding we've seen time and again, right? And moreover, it's a very Aristotelian position and is defended on independently plausible grounds, even by non-theists in the metaphysics literature. See Bador, Fowler, and others. More generally, God's nature doesn't ground God. Rather, God grounds God's nature. Potency dependence. Okay, so I've seen some people claim that if there were potency in God, then God would be dependent, since potencies are dependent on prior actualities. Again, this is kind of one where I've just seen on like the internet. Nope. The potencies of God could be posterior to and dependent on God's own actualities, or they could be dependent on God himself, decidedly not a potency. None of this requires there to be some external thing upon which God depends. Okay, Koons, God equals God's nature, part 2. Koons says, if God were distinct from his nature, then it would be possible for something else to share that nature. It is impossible for anything other than God to have God's nature, so God is identical to his nature. So I've already covered this argument in section 3.2, securing monotheism. The first claim is just flat out false, right? Consider being the ground of everything else is a perfection. God as a perfection being. Yes, God is a perfection being. God is a perfect being, essentially has all perfections, and so God is the ground of everything else. But there cannot be two different grounds of all else, for then they would each ground each other, which is absurd. Hence, God is necessarily unique. That has nothing to do with God being distinct from his own nature or what have you. We're just confusing necessary and sufficient conditions here. Yeah, maybe it's a sufficient condition for God's being unique that God is simple, although I challenge that in the securing monotheism section. That doesn't mean it's a necessary condition, and it's certainly not, as I think can be just decisively demonstrated with this perfection point. But anyway, I'm still open to being wrong, despite I said decisive demonstration. Okay, I also argued in section 3.2 that identifying God with God's nature doesn't actually help with securing monotheism, and furthermore seems to be inimical to Trinitarianism. Now, Koons also says that God is identical to God's existence. Here's his argument. Assume for contradiction that God's nature and the fact that God exists are distinct. 2, God's nature and the fact that God exists cannot be metaphysically independent of each other. And if they're not independent, well, then either the nature depends on the fact or the fact depends on the nature, or both depend on some third thing. Now, God's existence cannot depend on anything. So God's nature must depend on the fact of God's existence. But it's impossible for the existence of something to be metaphysically prior to its nature. So God's nature and the fact that God exists are identical. So God is identical to the fact that God exists. So one response is like, what is the fact that God exists? I mean, like, as Pruss uses it, facts are true propositions, but God obviously isn't identical to a true proposition. Other philosophers use facts to refer to obtaining states of affairs, but God isn't like a state of affairs. Like, what then is a fact? Well, Koons doesn't say. And as far as I can tell, a good way to respond to the argument is simply to say there are no such things as facts. There are concrete objects and their properties maybe, but there aren't these spooky entities over and above the objects and properties called facts. That's one way you could respond. Second way you could respond is, well, the non-classical theist can also reject premise 6, right? Because God grounds God's nature, God's existence likewise grounds his nature, right? God grounds God's nature, and so that just is to say that God's existence grounds God's nature. So they're just going to reject premise 6. And also, premise 6 also just conflicts with the Thomistic understanding of esse, that is the act of existence. Esse is primary in the sense that esse is prior to all else. In particular, as the principle of actuality, esse is prior to essence or nature, as act is prior to potency. This is a point that, like, for instance, Gavin Carr just points out and emphasizes a ton. Koons' argument here, he simply denied a fundamental tenet of Thomism, which is interesting if he describes himself as a Thomist. But anyway, so we can set that aside. I think that this is not going to be convincing because the non-classical theist just has perfectly they're perfectly well within their epistemic rights in either rejecting the existence of facts and or rejecting premise 6 because of this hold apart grounding. And also, it's just interesting that Thomism itself, the metaphysics of essay, counts against the argument. Koons also argues that composition entails some kind of coincidence. He involves any composite entity involves coincidences, correlated relations among the parts in the whole. Suppose, for example, that some entity X contains two proper parts, Y and Z. Given the Mereological principle of companionship, the fact that Y is a proper part of X entails that X is some other proper part. And similarly, the fact that Z is a proper part of X entails that X is some other proper part. The ultimate causal explanation of these coincidences cannot be a composite entity, since the unexplained unity of the cause would render it incapable of explaining the unity of its effect. Hence, we can infer the existence of at least one absolutely simple cause, the unity of the world. Lots of responses to this. First, it's just false that any composite entity involves coincidences. For example, it's no coincidence that it's not like it's some cosmic coincidence that omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, necessary existence, and so on are all together within God despite being distinct properties. Or consider a square. Like, it's no coincidence that the property of being four-sided, four equisided or whatever, and the property of being a square, which are different, by the way, it's no coincidence that those two are like necessarily connected, as it were. Now, obviously, you can have four-sided things without having squares, but in the other direction, there's no coincidence there at all. If you got a square, then yeah, you automatically have something that's four-sided. I guess I should say triangularity and trilaterality, right? Those two are certainly both necessarily co-instantiated with one another, but there's no coincidences there, despite the fact that that's a composite, or even a naturalistic necessary foundation. Again, that naturalists are going to say there's no coincidence here. We can appeal to metaphysical necessity and what have you. Regarding unexplained unity, I've already explained in section 3.5.1.2 on the Neo-Platonic proof why there can be perfectly adequate explanations of unity that don't adduce conservation or sustenance from a simple being. And I've also already explained why this is in tension with both Trinitarianism and incarnation. The claim that only the classical theist God could be the ultimate cause, or could be the only principled stopping point. Okay, could be ultimate. Like the claim that only the classical theist God could be ultimate, or could be the only principled stopping point for explanation, is utterly unfounded. One principled stopping point, for example, is given in Rasmussen's work based on limits, right? And Rasmussen is a thoroughgoing non-classical theist. We have the creation argument. Man, I'm at 3% battery, so I'm going to have to go and plug in. All right, on to the creation argument. Okay, so a proper part of X is a part of X that is not identical with X. So premise 1, everything other than God himself is created by God. Premise 2, if God has proper parts, then at least one proper part of God is not created by God. Premise 3, no proper part of God is identical with God. So, so if God has proper parts, then there is something that is neither identical with God nor created by God. So God has no proper parts, follows from 1 and 4. So here are two responses. Now, non-classical theists can easily reject premise 1. They will only accept that everything other than God himself is created by or grounded in God. And so even though God doesn't create some proper parts of his, like his omniscience or his omnipotence, he nevertheless grounds them. So again, hold apart grounding. Premise 1 may likewise be inimical to Trinitarianism, right? We have already seen that each of the persons is not numerically identical with God, but in that case, there are uncreated items that are numerically distinct from God. And so what's the problem with a numerically distinct item like omniscience being uncreated? Okay, so now section 3.6, perfect being theism. Suppose we grant the existence of a perfect being in the method of perfect being theism, or peanut butter and jelly. Then one could argue it is greater for a being to be, say, immutable and simple and timeless, etc., than not. Yeah, someone might argue that. Now, I don't know. Its plausibility might depend, but it doesn't seem quite plausible to me. But here are some examples. So the prisoner of time objection, right? So you might say that, oh, well, if God is temporal, then he's a prisoner of time, right? Time inexorably marches forward. And it seems God can do nothing about that, right? God also continually loses moments of his life. But shouldn't a perfect being have all of its life in a single superabundant experience? Like, isn't it a mark of imperfection to kind of like continually lose moments of your life? So for responses, you can see my video with Ryan here, as well as Ryan's paper here. He responds to that. And now the video linked above, answering classical theist objections to neoclassical theism, is also a general resource for part 1 that's quote unquote part one. I guess part one and part two. I'm really referring to parts of this document, that is, which is covered in parts one and two of this video. Now, one interesting response is the prisoner of timelessness objection. Now, you might actually think, for instance, that, well, even if God's being in time kind of serves as somehow God is a prisoner of time, well, if God is kind of locked in this timeless state, well, then it seems equally the case that he's a kind of prisoner of timelessness, right? There are a whole host of goods that God is experientially missing out on, say, goods of adventure with creatures, goods of, I don't know, just progressing along with creatures and so on. So, and kind of growing and seeing them grow and growing in your own relationship with them as you proceed through time, with them. So anyway, the kind of goods of adventure and growth and all that sort of stuff is going to be lost if you have a God that's just locked in this kind of timeless present, as it were. I think that the sword is double-edged, as it were, here. It's probably going to count both for and against divine timelessness, and so the arguments seem to be a wash, at least by my lights. There's also this Platonic argument, which has been influential in the tradition, but I don't know how influential it is today. I don't think many people find it all that plausible. So the argument is that change implies getting better or worse, but a perfect being cannot get better or worse. So a perfect being cannot change. So a perfect being is immutable. But changes don't imply getting better or worse, since there are axiologically neutral changes. For example, a particle alone in the universe goes from spin up to spin down. Like, the particle didn't get better or anything. Like, reality didn't get better. The particle didn't get better. It didn't get worse. Or God goes from knowing it's now noon to knowing it's now 12:01, right? This doesn't make God better. It just preserves or maintains his supreme value by preserving or maintaining his omniscience, right? He didn't get better or worse. Anyway, so I don't really find that Platonic argument all that plausible. And so my general assessment really of these perfect being theology arguments is meh. I mean, this one is kind of like the theological arguments. It's like open theists use perfect being theology to support their position. Neoclassical theists do it, panentheists do it, pantheists do it, classical theists do it. It's like, anyway, oftentimes it seems as though you can pretty much get a lot of intuitions going in both directions, say, and so they seem to oftentimes cancel out. But anyway, so that's that last section that we're going to be covering, perfect being theism. And in the next video, we're going to be or in the next two videos, I guess, part two, which is really just going to be part one and part two of a different series of videos, we're going to be looking at arguments against classical theism. But that does it for part one. Wow, we went through 71 pages of this document in two videos. But anyway, it was really fun. I, hope you guys enjoyed listening to this stuff, digging into the philosophy, digging into predication and necessity and de re and de dicto claims and all sorts of, goodies. So I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed putting it together. And I hope this serves you as you're, trying to think about the ultimate nature of reality, as you're trying to piece together your worldview. So anyway, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is the Majesty of Reason, and peace out.